The Loser by Isaac7525 Chapter 51-68. Shinso collapsed back to the floor, puffing in a large quantity of air as he took deep breaths. Damn it, how long will this shit take? Aaron sighed in disappointment and bent down to Shinso, offering the indigo-haired boy assistance. Shinso took the middle-aged man's hand and stood up, stretching as he let out a low, tired groan. Until your mind knows what it's doing, Shinso. Aaron replied, his tone almost fatherly as he smiled. Shinso's gaze remained on the man for a brief moment before he sighed softly. Anything specific I gotta do to get this done? I've been here for God knows how long. Shinso grumbled, extending his leg and kicking a book across the room. Remember what I said about chaos? The middle-aged man folded his arms across his chest and cocked an eyebrow. Shinso fell silent, remembering what he had been told. He remembered how chaos was the essence of failure. I know what you told me, but I can't quiet my mind. Shinso sat down in the chair, crossing one leg over the other and rubbing his temples with his index and middle finger. It's not about quieting one's mind, it's about focus. Aaron walked over to the seat opposite of Shinso and sat down, the fatherly smile never leaving his face. He extended both of his hands and placed them on Shinso's shoulders. Cogitation isn't a complete shutdown of one's mind, it's focusing on one thing. Yeah, that's impossible. Shinso scoffed, crossing his arms. What they told me when they said I'll be a hero. Aaron's brows furrowed as he cocked his head to the side. Become a hero. At that moment, Shinso realized what he had said and turned away from the man and looked out the window. It's nothing, he mumbled in a low voice. Seeing this, Aaron fell silent. The entire apartment seemed to fall silent for the most part, aside from the creaking of the chair following Aaron's movements. His grip habitually tightened around Shinso's shoulders, and he leaned in a little closer. You're not actin' this way because you're mad. You're just worried 'bout your boyfriend. Shinso's face suddenly flushed a deep crimson as he scoffed. I'm worried about where he is, but at the same time. The words seemed to get caught in his throat. He turned to look at Aaron, his usually dull eyes flashing with an uncharacteristic dose of sadness. I'm worried we'll never make it out alive here. The indigo-haired boy stood up from his chair, approaching the window and climbing onto the windowsill. His hands froze as he reached to open the window, his heart racing as his entire body seemed to freeze upon realizing what he was about to do. Kid, what are you doing? Aaron asked, his voice getting a little louder as he took a protective step towards Shinso. Oboro opened the closet, taking out what appeared to be a net. Maybe I'll quiet my mind if I find Isaac. Shinso replied, looking back at the duo. He suddenly caught sight of the net Oboro was holding, and he scoffed in annoyance. I was gonna jump out the window, but I'd look like a damn idiot if I'm caught in that thing. Shinso huffed as he stepped down from the window. Aaron continued to stare at the spot where Shinso once was, his gaze continually fixated on the window and the heavy snowfall outside. You'll freeze to death out there. Aaron warned, finally turning away and approaching the coat rack. The middle-aged man extended his right arm in front of the door, preventing Shinso from leaving. The indigo-haired boy ignored this warning, putting on his coat and left the apartment room, making his way into the hallway of the apartment building. Oboro stepped forward, ready to swing the net downwards onto Shinso, but he was stopped by Aaron, who grabbed it from him mid-swing. No need for that, Oboro. Shinso remained silent, his entire body tense for a brief moment. His fists clenched at his sides. You're not worried about him. We haven't seen him and the weather is horrible. Shinso's defensiveness to find his friend caused something inside Aaron to churn. He stepped forward into the hallway and put a hand on Shinso's shoulder. Sometimes, the right thing isn't the best thing, Shinso. Aaron said softly, his eyes flickering with ambivalence. He suddenly pulled Shinso into the room, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. I don't wanna stop you from doing the right thing, but the weather out there will kill you. Isaac's a smart, resourceful boy, I'm sure he'll find a way to make it inside. He didn't even say he was leaving. Shinso pouted slightly. He's awfully independent though. Earlier this week he got me medicine from a vendor in the market because Catherine couldn't. He was the first person to ever treat me with kindness aside from my parents, he and his friend, Ayumi. If I don't find him, I wouldn't be doing him any good. Shinso looked up at Eren, wringing out of his grip. This time, Eren didn't resist. He stepped back from Shinso and raised his arms in surrender. Seeing this, Shinso was overcome with confusion. Puzzled, he stepped back into the hallway whilst glancing at the duo. A moment ago you didn't want me to leave. Eren's lips curled upwards into a faint smile. What you're doing is actually quite brave. You're inadvertently digesting your potion right now, kid. Huh. Shinso quickly glanced at his stomach. The man reached for the Kotrak and handed Oboro a thick winter coat. But he's coming with you, we don't want you being all alone out there. No, no, no. Continue, what did you mean about digesting my potion? Shinso prompted. Making the toughest decisions no one else would, possessing good judgment, and doing the right thing regardless of adversity are the essence of a scale shifter. Eren's words hung in the air for a few silent seconds before Shinso could completely register them. This pathway was made for you, kid. Eren smiled, patting Shinso on the back. The indigo-haired boy's face flushed with embarrassment, and he turned away with a small whine. Stop that. All right, Mr. Goody. Oboro stepped beside Shinso, offering the boy a knowing smirk. Shinso looked at the young man with cloud-like hair for a moment before showing a small smile. Your room. Olivia was puzzled when she heard the elderly woman's words. At that moment, Aizawa shot out of his chair and darted towards the door. What the hell are we doing? We spent our time here instead of looking for Isaac. The door flew open and Aizawa darted into the snow with renewed vigor. Olivia had now just realized their transgression. Her eyes widened in guilt as she looked back at the elderly woman in their booth. What about her? She asked, pointing towards the cloaked figure. The dark-haired man fell silent, his expression softening for a brief moment before he sighed. Bring her along. The woman nodded, helping her up and assisting her out the door. When they departed from the pub, the winds had ceased blowing outside, making their job a little easier. On the contrary, the snow continued to pummel down, the white powder almost reaching their knees. The kerosene-powered lamps overhead continued to buzz, but the trio took notice of them flickering every few minutes. Seeing this, Aizawa turned back to the duo with a contemplative expression. You think the power will be cut from the snow? Olivia looked up at the gas lamps and made a guess. If the snow keeps coming down, it's possible. At that moment, the elderly woman began to cough and hack violently. Her sunken eyes widened in terror as her hand clasped around her throat. Dear God, she's choking. Olivia cried out, gazing at Aizawa in uncertainty on what to do. Aizawa rushed over and assessed the woman's condition. Based on the frequency of her coughs, asking a question on her status to speak would obviously result in a negative answer. After flashing through the next course of action, Aizawa made his way to the back of the woman and began to perform the Heimlich. He brought his fists inward, pumping into the woman's lower abdomen in an effort to dislodge the object from her throat. At the same time, Olivia thrust her arms upwards to further amplify the chance of success. The patrons inside the pub continued to drink, though they remained tense from what had happened moments ago. They didn't see what was transpiring outside. Even if they did, Aizawa and Olivia weren't sure they'd offer assistance. Damn it, we can't let her die. Aizawa spat through gritted teeth. He continued to pummel his hands inwards with renewed vigor, causing Olivia to strengthen the magnitude of her own movements. The elderly woman continued to cough, her eyes rolling back into her head, showing only the whites. Just then, her body fell slack and she fell down onto the cobblestone road. Aizawa's face paled, and he was unable to speak. A small lump formed in his throat, but he quickly swallowed it as he bent down. A look of absolute determination crossed his face as he continued to pump the woman's abdomen with increasing desperation. I won't let you die on me, Aizawa whispered. As he continued to pump the woman in an attempt to dislodge the object, his body flinched the moment he heard a dry, measly cough. At that moment, a small vial left her mouth, shooting into the air and landing in the street. The dark-haired man fell silent, his lips curling into a faint smile. Olivia heaved a sigh of relief as she approached the woman, helping her up onto her feet. Just then, she heard a small whimper from the man beside her. She turned her head to look at him, and her grayish-blue eyes widened when she saw tears run down his face. "Shota," she whispered, bringing her hand up to wipe them away. The taller man didn't flinch or resist, letting the process occur naturally. "Don't cry, she's okay now," Olivia whispered, her lips curling into a faint smile as she finished wiping away the accumulated tears. "I did it, Obero," he mumbled. "What?" Olivia's brows creased. Just then, she bent down and picked up the peculiar vial that had been lodged from the woman's throat. "He told me not to freeze, he told me to keep doing, that was his MO." "What are you saying?" Olivia continued to gaze at the man with a contemplative expression. Aizawa finally collected himself and looked down at Olivia. His lips curled upwards into a small smile as he wiped the remaining tears. "I'll explain later." The woman fell silent as she sighed. She then turned back to the elderly woman. "About what you said earlier, you wanted to go back to your room." The woman nodded, her hands lightly caressing her throat. "Yes. Home is that way." She extended one of her bony hands, pointing opposite of the direction the duo was looking to go. The street lights didn't shine down the road, and all the lights of the buildings were off. Seeing this, Olivia felt a shudder course down her spine. She looked back to Aizawa and cocked her head. "Should we split up, or should we both help her?" Aizawa took a deep, shaky breath as his expression gradually regressed to normal. "I suppose we can help her, I'm sure Isaac's safe by now. The winds have stopped for the most part." "You." The duo heard a voice behind them, causing them both to freeze in their spots. The elderly woman's shoulders lifted slightly, and she turned around to face the unknown figure. Aizawa and Olivia both exchanged glances, unaware of why the woman would do such a thing. Trusting their intuition, they both turned to face the voice they had heard. Within the continually pummeling snow, they saw the silhouette of a figure. They appeared to be feminine, donning a thick coat and boots. Her hair was tousled into a bun. "Ms. Hampshire." The silhouette darted over to their elderly woman, taking her by the hand. The woman's lips curled up into a faint smile as she greeted the woman with a smile. "Hello, dear. Let's get you back home, all right." She took Ms. Hampshire by the hand and began to walk into the darkness she had previously pointed into. "Where are you taking her?" Aizawa inquired, crossing his arms defensively. The much younger woman turned around to face him with a stern expression. "The asylum. Aslium." Hearing the woman's answer, Aizawa was immediately taken aback. There was an asylum in Seraphis Kingdom. The woman didn't answer, instead, she led the elderly woman into the darkness. After she departed, he turned to Olivia, who was crouching down on the ground. Seeing this, he cocked an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" Olivia stood up and turned around to face him. She uncurled her hand, showing the small vial she held in her palm. The vial was about the size of her thumb. Inside, they could both see a semi-transparent black liquid sloshing around. "This was what she was choking on," Olivia said, holding up the object so Aizawa could obtain a clearer view. Aizawa slowly took the vial and studied it carefully. The vial didn't have any labels or indications of its contents anywhere on its surface. "We'll investigate this later. For now, we should keep looking for Isaac." With a low sigh, he tucked the vial into a pocket on his coat and sealed it shut. With all their focus gravitated to the vial, the duo didn't realize the quantity of snowfall had decreased a helpful amount. They both looked up to the sky and took notice of this. Olivia's lips twitched into a small smile as she looked back at Aizawa. "This'll be much more helpful." Aizawa nodded without saying a word. Due to the storm now having passed a gradual amount, the thick clouds overhead began to pass over the kingdom. The crimson moon's light began to protrude through the previously dark clouds, making their way forward much more accessible. Though, the snow in the streets had piled to almost their knees, so moving via the sidewalk was an easier option to ensure they wouldn't catch frostbite. That was one of Olivia's biggest worries. Back at UA, she had worked as both a nurse and a guidance counselor. If one of them caught frostbite, Olivia considered the fact that these were Victorian times instead of the modern world, and amputations would be much more violent and possibly lead to more problems, including infections. Maybe Isaac can move freely now, Aizawa prompted, scanning the street closely. Wherever he is, he's most likely noticed the weather conditions outside. Olivia shook her head and began to speak. It's possible he doesn't. About 2 days ago I eavesdropped on a conversation between Carter, him, and his friends. He had initially prompted the trio to get a job here. At that moment, something went off in Aizawa's mind. He had taken notice of the job catalog sitting on the counter back at the apartment, but he thought little of it. Perhaps we can figure out where he went by using the papers. Aizawa turned around, glancing back at Olivia. He's bound to choose something easy, he's smart like that. After a short moment of deliberation, Olivia eventually walked forward and stood next to Aizawa, nodding her head in agreement. The walk back to the parterre de fleurs wasn't as grueling as the walk out of it. The closer they got to the apartment, the louder and more urban everything seemed to become. Oddly, most of the accumulated snowfall had been paved by the workers, allowing street carriages and pedestrians to navigate freely without much issue. Turning back into the apartment, Aizawa immediately darted for the stack of papers sitting on the counter. Olivia followed suit, picking up a similar paper and placing them side by side on the table. So, there's easy, medium, and hard jobs, Olivia deduced, pointing to the indicators on the sheet labeling the numerous professions and their difficulties. He'd most likely choose something easy. He doesn't have the necessary experience to pursue anything extraordinary, Aizawa said, flipping the page. The first 3 jobs labeled were dog walker, babysitter, and window cleaner. Do you think he'd like any of these? Aizawa asked, turning to look at Olivia. The woman looked down at the descriptions and considered the details. Perhaps I could get Mr. Ryujin, he's talked with Isaac before. Right, I was the one who introduced him to the boy. Aizawa quickly recalled the first time he had seen me. He was bullied and had some pretty bad marks. The man reminisced. Hearing those words, Olivia felt her heart sink. The fact that he's alone right now. What if he has no one to talk to? Mr. Ryujin raised his head, roused from his romance novel upon hearing the deliberate knocks on the door. Letting out a low groan, he stood up and cracked his back before slipping on a robe from the closet. Slowly walking over to the door, he put the book on the bedside dresser and opened it. Olivia? He asked, his eyes half-lidded as he rubbed the residual tiredness from them. The man with horns was taken aback the moment Olivia took him by the arm, pulling him into the apartment lobby and sitting him down at the desk. We have a few things to ask you in regards to Isaac. All right, Mr. Ryujin's expression remained speculative for the most part, but he quickly softened the moment he caught sight of the concern in Olivia's expression. Shinso and Oboro continued their way down the streets. The snow beneath their feet had piled up, but it wasn't to a dangerous extent, or one that needed them to waddle to move properly. I wouldn't recommend shouting for him, you'd rouse the neighbors, maybe even a criminal gang, and have your head removed, Oboro said, looking down at Shinso. I wasn't gonna shout. Shinso stuffed his hands into his pocket and continued walking down the road. On either side of the streets were gas lamps that flickered, occasionally cutting off their source of light. Seeing this, Oboro let out a low sigh. If this issue keeps persisting, we might have to turn back. No. Shinso stepped forward in front of Oboro, crossing his arms over his chest. We went out here to look for him, not to turn back because the lamps are flickering. Shinso's voice was deadpan. You scared of the dark or something? Oboro's face flushed a tiny amount as he turned to look away from Shinso. Yes, I am to a small extent. Hearing this, Shinso let out a low, tired groan. If the lamps do flicker down, you can run back to your apartment. But I'm staying out here, I'm gonna be the one to find him. Alright, Oboro choked out, a tiny beam of sweat running down his brows. The duo kept walking down the street for a few moments, occasionally taking note of the flickering lamps on either side of the road. No carriage or pedestrian seemed to be outside at this time, either because of the weather or the time of night. Suddenly, one of the stores on the road sparked to life, causing Oboro to flinch and stumble back a bit. Shinso raised one of his bushy eyebrows, momentarily stunned. Why would they open at this time of night? Taking a step forward, Shinso peered into the window of the building. It appeared to be a store, with numerous products lined on old, wooden shelves. Some looked like metal skeletons, others appeared to be simple china and culinary antiques. Looks like a store, Shinso turned back to Oboro. I'm not one to buy stuff this late at night, the blue-haired man scoffed. Well, we could at least warm up a bit, Shinso grumbled as he opened the front door, causing the overhead bell to gently ring. The attendant behind the counter, a woman with yellow eyes and blonde hair, lifted her head and smiled at the duo entering. Hello there. Shinso nodded without saying a word, leaning against the wall. The woman behind the front counter suddenly stood up and walked out from behind. Name's Florence, if you're interested in anything here, don't hesitate to holler my name, she said with a smile. Why open this late? Shinso asked, crossing his arms as he bore a speculative scowl. The woman's smile faltered slightly as she frowned. Unfortunately, I've only moved here from the country a few months ago, and I've been shut out of my adopted house due to this awful weather. Shinso turned back to the weather outside, pointing out the window. It doesn't look that bad outside. The blonde-haired woman leaned past Shinso, catching sight of the lighter snowfall pummeling down. It is. Great. She approached the front of her store, grabbing her light coat that hung on the rack. Following that, she turned back to the others with a smile. Unfortunately, walking home alone isn't the best thing here, she said, frowning. Oboro turned to look at Shinso, who now appeared confused. This kingdom, as it is wealthy, also crawls with perverts and prostitutes. She'd get snatched off the streets and be forced to do all sorts of awful things. Oh, Shinso's face paled slightly. Feeling a surge of protectiveness, Shinso stepped towards the door and held it open for Florence. I wouldn't mind helping you home, he said, attempting to hide the reluctance in his voice. Florence smiled, nodding her head with gratitude. Aren't you a gentleman? As they all stepped out into the streets, the blonde-haired woman paused and adjusted her coat. Though, I must ask if you've seen the advertisement in the papers. Shinso shook his head. No, I haven't. Florence's lips curled into a smile as she began to walk forward. My master, Madame Fitzgerald, is looking for a babysitter for her child. Babysitting. The reluctance in Shinso protruded as he sucked in through his teeth. Not my cup of tea. Just then, she sighed. It doesn't appear to be anyone else's, nobody's shown up to apply. Well, Shinso sighed softly, looking forward. I'm personally not good with kids, neither is anyone I know. Except, maybe, him, his expression softened, looking down at the snow-covered sidewalk. Who? Florence turned her head to look at Shinso, her eyes widening. The indigo-haired boy rubbed the back of his neck as a small amount of blush crept up his cheeks. His name's Isaac. He's kind and stuff to me, the first person ever to tell me that my quirk doesn't define who I am. Quirk. Florence seemed taken aback, quickly changing the subject to focus on the unfamiliar term. Right, Shinso mentally facepalmed at the realization of mentioning something outside of this new world. I sat alone in the bedroom after Florence had departed for a few moments before standing up, focusing my attention towards the incense candle infused with the night vanilla. What are you planning? The umbrage asked in an ethereal voice. Their incomplete projection didn't manifest in the room when they spoke, which I found partially strange. Remember what that hooded figure told me in the tent a while back? I asked. You plan on using a mentally based method to find out more? The umbrage prompted me further. I nodded my head, grabbing the candle from the dresser and placing it in the center of the floor. Just then, I heard another question. Do you even know how to do such a thing? I was hoping you'd assist me, I said with a small smile. The ethereal voice sighed softly at that moment, and the symbol on my forehead began to glow without bearing a burn. Using meditation, you can dive into the astral void to receive the corresponding knowledge. Astral void. What about my mind? The mention of a new realm of existence sent a shiver coursing down my spine. If information corresponding to this realm would lead to extreme corruption, the best I could do was practice the method in a safer space. No, child. We aren't venturing into the astral void I plugged my ears. Nope. An abnormal chill suddenly surged through my arms, and I felt them moving on their own as they were lowered. Seeing this, I let out a low groan. If I'm telling you this, it won't damage you, the umbrage calmly scolded. The feelings in my arms gradually resurfaced as I was able to move them once again. Just then, the night vanilla candle ignited with purplish-blue flames from the tip unlike before. Previously, it had only shone with a purple hue. I bent down to observe the candle, extending my arm to pick it up. At that moment, the surrounding room darkened, and I stood back as illusory, iron-black pillars surged upwards from the void, stretching to an infinite height into a dark fog that drifted above. The walls shot up along with them, protruding upwards into the fog as well. The throne, carpet, and floor gradually materialized beneath my feet, and the circular window showcasing my mind all surfaced in a matter of moments. My body remained still, and my grip on the candle remained akin to a vice. After everything had fallen silent, I opened my eyes and habitually scanned my surroundings. Everything was as it was the first time I had come here, including the throne on the far end of the room in front of the window. A pair of illusory, wormhole-like eyes emerged from the darkness, boring down at me. You ready? I flinched, almost dropping the candle as I gazed up at the eyes within the dark fog. Give a warning next time, damn it. My voice turned layered and ethereal, a deeper voice showing through on top of my regular one. Hearing this, I immediately covered my mouth, my face turning a ghastly pale color. What was that? The umbrage exhaled deeply, as if tired by my current demeanor. Your spirit voice is one all apocalypse seekers are able to use here. If you try hard enough, it can resurface in the real world if your emotions get too out of control. Is that the same situation with what happened with Bertram and my body? I recalled the incident in the hallway near Wilfred's room, how a pair of illusory, crimson horns had manifested atop my head and the sigil produced an abnormal reaction. The umbrage nodded. It's all related to your spirit body. Just then, the night vanilla candle began to tremble in my grip, the bluish-purple flames quickly turning a crimson red as the surface of the wax turned a similar color. The casing of the candle turned an iron-black color, and the apocalypse sigil manifested on the bottom of the item. Seeing this, my eyes widened as I set down the item, taking a step back. I gazed down at the item that had transformed. Looking back up at the umbrage, I pointed at the candle. Will it look like that in the real world? No, they replied in their ethereal tone. Why did it change though? You can also corrupt spirit items, or simply, change an item that has a spiritual form through physical contact. To a small extent, its purpose might change too. Gazing back down at the night vanilla candle, I bent down and picked it up again. So, it might be easier to find out more about it. We shall see. I felt my body suddenly move on its own, sitting myself down with my legs crossed. Now, I want you to close your eyes. I slowly closed my eyes following the entity's instructions. As I began to slowly take deep breaths, an unfamiliar sensation coursed through my body. I felt my body leave the floor, slowly rising into the air before coming to a halt the moment I opened my eyes once again. With a sudden drop, I hit the floor once again. Was I just floating? I asked, slowly standing back up whilst rubbing my lower back. I gazed up into the dark fog for an answer, but nothing could be heard. I only saw the illusory eyes gazing back down at me. Try again. Ignore the floating sensation. All right. With a sigh, I sat back down and crossed my legs, assuming the same position from before. As I began to take slow, deep breaths, the unfamiliar sensation returned. Upon seeing my lack of response, the umbrage spoke again. Now, mentally reach out and channel the night vanilla candle. Hearing this, my brows furrowed. Like telekinesis. No, visualize in your head, the umbrage continued. The image of the candle surfaced in my mind, the clear image of the now red and black candle appearing crystal clear. Just then, more images flashed. I saw the demonic tyrant sitting atop his throne, smiling wickedly at me. I felt my body run cold, and I broke out into a sweat. I can't focus. I strained out, the unsettling image of the entity gradually taking shape over the candles, mental projection. The gray-skinned demon sat on his throne with a smile before he stood up, walking over to me. I remained floating in the air, the image playing out clearly in my mind. Trying to forget me again? He asked, extending his hand and wrapping it around my chin. I froze, my skin turning bitterly cold as I felt the sensation taking over in the real world. I tried to open my eyes to escape this scene, but my eyelids seemed to be rusted shut. The demonic tyrant grinned as if sensing my struggle, picking up his sword perched beside their throne like a trophy. He slowly raised the weapon, running it along the edge of my cheek, the movements precise enough to cause a small amount of pain yet refuse to draw blood. I remained frozen, my heart racing in my chest as this towering creature resembling my father continued his ministrations upon my face. You know you can't escape me, that this destiny you've consumed in a bottle will always come to pass, his voice lowered, turning guttural and demonic. His other hand wrapped around the back of my neck, pulling me closer towards him. His eyes were a pitch black shade bearing crimson pupils that gave off no light, only embracing the surrounding darkness. You're like a rat caught in my grasp, in destiny's grasp. You were tired enough of being called a damn loser that you'd toss away the thought of sanity just to drink that bottle and become powerful. He pulled me even closer, his mouth a hair's breadth from my ear. If only you weren't meant to destroy the world and laugh upon it. Just then, everything fell silent, and the image of the night vanilla candle resurfaced in my mind. Though, the image was slightly hazy. I was too preoccupied by my emotions. Tears began to slowly stream down my face. My heart continued to race, and as soon as it appeared, the image of the candle dissipated away. My body then fell back to the floor with a bang. My eyes remained tightly clasped shut, and the tears kept freely falling. A strange aching pain surfaced within me as I let out a low sob, burying my head in my chest. I didn't want the umbrage to see me crying, that'd be embarrassing. I didn't want to move, but at the same time, I wanted to find that thing and rip it limb from limb. Did I drink that potion to not be powerless? Did I consume that bottle just so I could survive in this world? I've already become aware of the hidden dangers here, and the fact that merely mentioning them is a great danger. If I was only compatible with a pathway of destruction, was it a good job to drink that potion to prove his point? Calm down. I heard the umbrage's illusory voice call from above me. This time, it was closer to me, they had descended in person to visit me. My eyes slowly opened, the half-lids catching sight of the ethereal cloaked entity standing before me. They looked down at me, their crimson pupils boring into me with an uncharacteristic pang of sympathy. Just then, they bent down before me, placing a hand on my shoulder. That wasn't real, Isaac. That was merely a projection of your mind. That's what my father is, a demon. I choked out, the words bitterly leaving my mouth. My voice was half guttural like the first time my emotions got out of control in this place. The umbrage shook their head. He's ruthless, yes. But that doesn't paint him as a demon. They took a step forward towards me, placing a bony hand on my shoulder. He's the only thing stopping you at this moment. If you want to learn more, you must remove the barriers preventing you from doing so. I fell silent for a few moments, my voice a low, choked sob. He's tormented me my whole life, I can't just forget him like that. The umbrage didn't say a word, instead, their form turned illusory as they disappeared. Gradually fading away, they spoke to me for a final time. Then that's your fault. The eyes in the fog didn't show up, nothing appeared to indicate their presence. Where are you going? There wasn't a reply at all. I was stunned, they just left me like that. Suddenly, an illusory piece of paper descended from an unknown location, transforming from a vortex of crimson and black energy. I slowly reached for the paper with a trembling hand. If you are to learn, the barriers must fall. The paper read in neat handwriting. At the bottom of the paper was a signature, the umbrage. The umbrage had forsaken me at this critical moment, just like that. Why would they leave so abruptly? I shoved all my previous emotions aside, stood back up and dusted my outfit off. I had looked like a whimpering, crying fool around the deity because of my problems, my inability to forget the past and move on like they said I should. The best I could do for the time being was complete the given assignments. I wasn't going to cry and sulk for the next few hours simply because they left me for an unknown time period. After making a quick deduction with the knowledge I had learned, the umbrage most likely wasn't far from the current location, as the bond between a spirit creature and its host was unique. I know you're not far from here, I said, gazing upwards into the blackened fog. This time, no pairs of eyes surfaced, and no illusory voice signaled for me. At that moment, the blood moon charm in my pajama pocket buzzed erratically, and the illusory sound of the door opening from the real world instantly snagged my attention. In an instant, I transferred my physical and mental body down to the real world, gazing towards the doorway in half a second. If the charm went off due to an abnormal change or spiritual presence, I had to quickly find out what it was. The door was left slightly ajar, the darkness of the hallway protruding into the room. I narrowed my eyes, attempting to discern any environmental changes that could have caused the charm's abnormal reaction. Suddenly, the blood moon charm buzzed again, with more ferocity than before. Before I could react, I felt a pair of cold hands coil around my mouth, preventing me from breathing. A woman with pale skin, whitened hair and a pair of black eyes with yellow pupils manifested from the shadows, extending their forked tongue from their mouth and trailing it along the edge of my cheek. She was clad in Florence's pink nightgown. Just then, it hit me. This was Florence, the umbrage's guess had been correct. Shinso dropped the unfamiliar concept, blaming it on some obscure term he learned in a history book that corresponded to a lesson he was learning in alchemy. Florence didn't seem to find it peculiar, as she kept walking without making any additional comments. Either the men of the era don't favor lavish women, or they aren't tolerable with kids, Florence guessed, continuing the topic from a short while ago. I mean, most men I've met possess a good ethic, they wouldn't want to be treated lavishly, Oboro commented as he continued walking forward. Florence suddenly froze as she continued staring forward. Reminds me of a man I once knew, and loved. She turned back to the duo and smiled. Though, I'm sure he would have loved the babysitting occupation. Shinso and Oboro fell silent. A faint blush crept up Shinso's cheeks, causing him to turn away slightly. We can both relate, I guess. Seeing this, the woman chuckled softly. You must care about him deeply. Shinso nodded his head. I do, but... He trailed off for a few moments, his attention gravitated towards the falling snow. When I showed my love for him, he didn't seem like he wanted to love me back. Florence took a step towards Shinso and smiled. Just because they don't instantly like you back doesn't mean they don't love you at all. Just then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a photo. It showcased two people clad in farm attire. One of them was Florence, and the other was a man standing beside her, holding her hand. They stood in an open field, a long outcrop with evergreen trees in the distance. That's my husband, Nicholas. Shinso and Oboro gazed down at the photo for a brief moment before looking back up at her. Why isn't he with you then? The blonde-haired woman sighed softly, her expression softening a little as she began to explain. He and I were farmers a few hundred miles from here. His parents kicked him out of their house for being, in their words, a freeloader. Her thumb absent-mindedly traced tiny circles around the man's face as she continued explaining, her gaze never having left the photograph. Though, me and my family favored him, he had already come for dinner numerous times. In the end, we let him into our house, and eventually, me and him got wed in the woods. She looked down at the photo, smiling. They even hired a photographer, a luxury only kingdom dwellers can attain. Florence tucked the photo back into her pocket. Unfortunately, trouble envies those who are fortunate. The Seraphis Kingdom district stopped by our farm, informing us of the new act that would sell all of our profits in their direction. In return, our farm could grow larger and make more money, at the expense of our crops going only to them. So they straight up let you starve. Shinso's fists involuntarily clenched at his sides as he kept walking. In a way, yes. Florence responded as they rounded a corner. Suddenly, a figure lunged out of the shadows. A short, young man carrying a pocket knife pointed it directly to Florence's throat. The woman tensed, her face visibly turning pale as she failed to move a muscle. "How about, you and I go somewhere more private?" He leaned in closer, his hot, putrid breath forming a small puff of mist as it left his mouth. Shinso remained frozen, his gaze fixated on the knife in the man's hand. Feeling a hot surge of anger course through him, he clenched his fists tighter and approached the man. It seemed like his muscles were moving on their own. As the closer he slowly stumbled, the more he regretted this decision. "Shinso!" Oboro cried out. Just then, the indigo-haired boy was caught off guard the moment the knife grazed his direction. The attack cut across his cheek, but it was barely deep enough to bring up blood. Shinso raised his hand to his cheek, feeling the warm liquid slowly drip down his face. He looked back at the man, whose icy black eyes gave an inscrutable warning sign. "Don't try anything, kid. I'll dice you to pieces, we all will." The man's voice was low as smiled, bearing a grin that showcased all of his rotten teeth. Shinso froze, his body running cold like the surrounding air. At that moment, he felt a pair of hands snatch him from behind, wrapping around his waist and pulling him backwards into the street. Shinso slammed his head back, sending himself into the unknown attacker. The collision was enough to loosen the grip, and the sudden sensation of freedom robbed off Shinso's balance for a few moments. He darted back to his attacker, another man. He was a little taller than Shinso, and he was clad in all-white attire, an outfit akin to a jumpsuit. The man let out a low growl as he ran towards Shinso again, lowering his body and ramming himself into the boy head-on. The attack sent Shinso back again, sending the boy tumbling down the snow-covered street. Florence remained still as the knife continued to hover around her throat, while Oboro wasted no time in assisting Shinso. He removed his breasted coat and dashed into the street, leaping into the air and landing a kick to the jumpsuit-clad man's left jaw. Shinso watched in astonishment as the bottom of his boots lit up with a faint blue. Oboro jumped up again, literally running on the air as he continued to brawl with the attackers. He leapt around like a cat, the enhanced boots enabling his agility to go beyond regular human constraints. His gaze immediately fell back to Florence and the knife-bearing attacker. With a low groan, he stood back up and shook off the debris and snow that clung to his attire. Rolling up his sleeve, he dashed towards the man and raised his fist, landing a punch to his cheek. He was sent back a short stumble, but he quickly recovered his equilibrium in time to dodge the next attack. Raising his head, he scanned his surroundings for anything he could use to subdue this attacker aside from his knife. Just then, Shinso's lips curled upwards into a smile. "How many men do you think it'll take to stop my friend?" he asked, gesturing towards Oboro, who was subduing the attackers with little effort. "Hey, maybe." The man's eyes glazed over, turning an icy white shade. He fell silent as his lower lip slacked downwards. A trail of drool and saliva trickled from his mouth, running down his chin and landing in the snow. "Always the confrontational ones," he scoffed, tucking his hands back into his pockets. He turned back to Florence, the woman looking taken aback by the sudden change in the man's demeanor. "I would interrogate him now, but my abilities doesn't allow him to perform complex actions." "Right." Florence seemed too stunned to get out a proper sentence. Shinso turned back to the man, letting out a low, tired sigh. "Sit down and think about what you've done, okay?" The man with glazed eyes silently obeyed the given commands, sitting down in the frigid snow and staring blankly at the wall. Shinso was about to join Oboro, but he looked back to the man, his lips curling into a smirk. "While you're at it, mind giving my friend here your shirt, she looks awfully cold." Oboro landed another kick to one of the men, sending them back. His spiritual intuition clocked in shortly after, causing him to weave to the side and dodge another attack. Extending his left foot, he landed a kick to the surprise attacker's back, sending him into the other man. Oboro scoffed once all the men were disposed of, lying in the middle of the road like discarded pieces of trash. He took out a pipe from his pocket and blew into it, letting out a trail of smoke as he exhaled. You know smoking'll kill you if you don't die in battle. Shinso commented, stepping beside Oboro and observing the scene. If smoking really is detrimental like you claim, I'm pretty sure I'd be dead by now. He suddenly extended his right hand to Shinso, looking down at him as he offered a smile. Shinso's lips curled up, bearing a small grin as they both high-fived. Turning back to the scene before them, the duo immediately took notice of their peculiar matching outfits. All of the half-unconscious men in the street were clad in white uniforms, which were now littered with debris and wetted by the snow. If I can brainwash them one by one, I can have them sit here until the law enforcement are informed. Brainwash. I thought you just consumed your potion. Oboro appeared momentarily puzzled as he watched Shinso approach the men. He turned back to Oboro and offered him a small smirk. It's already in my toolkit. Now go see if Florence is all right. Oboro nodded, approaching the woman and offering her assistance. Shinso had already long known the limitations of his quirk, so attempting to prompt out information from the men wasn't achievable even with the brainwashing. The boy couldn't enable people to conduct complex functions like memory recollection or anything related to their minds. He had prompted the men with gentle questions like, "Are you all right?" Or had resorted to straight-up taunting them for their victory over them to get them to reply. As long as they replied to anything Shinso said, they would succumb to the brainwashing. He then directed them one by one to sit down and wait for the law enforcement to show up. He also couldn't command more than one person at a time, so the process quickly grew tedious. They're all in these white uniforms, Shinso made a deduction as he approached Oboro, turning back around to gaze at the scene of the dazed men sitting in the middle of the road. They look like uniforms a prisoner would wear, Oboro observed, putting the pipe back into his mouth and blowing out a small stream of smoke. Wouldn't it be weird though, all these men on the road? Shinso pointed to the cluster. The pollinators will get this situation settled, the blue-haired man said, stuffing the pipe back into a hidden pocket on his coat. The pollinators. The boy turned to look at him, momentarily confused. Just then, Florence spoke up. The faction of Mother Nature's church that deals with criminals. She pointed east and turned back at the duo. Their headquarters are down that way. If you're up to it, I could delay my arrival and inform them of what happened. Shinso shook his head. My brainwashing lasts for an indefinite amount of time. Due to this part of the kingdom not having that many people from what I've observed, the chance of someone rousing them from it and running away freely. This part of Seraphis' kingdom was lined with tall buildings bearing smokestacks which pumped out thick amounts of smoke into the sky. The roads weren't as clustered with snow, but the roads were icy to a certain extent. How far is your establishment from here? Oboro asked. Only about another 10 minutes. If we leave now, you two can go to the pollinators and report this happening with time to spare. All right, Oboro nodded his head to Shinso. Come now, the closer we get her home, the higher a chance we have of finding wherever Isaac is. I once requested the kid jot down stuff in a journal, but he hasn't come to me since to tell me anything. Mr. Ryujin leaned back in his chair, prompting his feet up onto the table. What have you learned from his past entries? Aizawa asked, remaining still in his chair whilst flipping through the catalogue of jobs. Well, he doesn't really speak to me through journal entries. But rather, he talks to me about his dreams, one dream in particular. Aizawa cocked an eyebrow. Go on. Mr. Ryujin slowly let out a long sigh. He dreamt of a boy playing in the forest, and he ended up killing a bird by accident. His hands absent-mindedly rapped against the wooden table as he kept explaining. This boy was scorned for being foolish and stupid for doing that. Now that you killed one of the animals, the rest might not want to play with you. Mr. Ryujin had recalled what I had said in precise detail, a trait gained from helping hundreds of students with their own issues. We came here for a psychological profile, not a philosophy ramble, Olivia sighed, lowering her head into her hands, which wrapped into her blonde locks. But, you see, at that moment, Mr. Ryujin took out an object from his pocket. It appeared to be a small black book with a spiral-bound binding. The pages of the book were wrinkled around the edges, a silent telling of its origins. In order to understand one, you must peer into their thoughts. Isn't that right, assistant counselor? Even if Olivia was one of UA's guidance counselors, she was overall new to the profession. She had known Mr. Ryujin during her time as a school nurse. Olivia's face flushed slightly as she sighed. I'm still learning, we both are. The man with dragon horns flipped through the weathered journal for a few moments before turning the book to the others. On the pages were 3 lines etched in barely legible, crimson handwriting. Seeing these phrases, Aizawa's face couldn't help but visibly pale. What the? He slowly took the book from Mr. Ryujin, analyzing the writing closely. Is this Isaac's journal? Mr. Ryujin nodded. Yep. I'm not one for prying, but before we initially conducted his quirk test, I snuck into his backpack and took it out for safekeeping. He patted his pocket. If I hadn't done so, it'd be trapped in an entirely different dimension with no way to read it. Aizawa's eyes narrowed as he read through the lines. These are awfully morbid. Olivia glared at the journal too, but she refrained from making any comments. Her eyes were widening as she gradually translated the messy handwriting. Mr. Ryujin dragged his feet off the table and sighed softly. As you can see from what he's written, his psychological profile is one that piques my interest. Aizawa looked at Mr. Ryujin, his expression slowly resembling a glare. You sound like you want to test him. The man shook his head, raising his arms in defense. I don't consent to doing things like that. In a way, he's still a child with boundaries that need to be respected. But, you'll still try to learn more about this, right? Olivia pointed to the black journal in Aizawa's hands. Mr. Ryujin nodded. Indeed. He silently took back the journal and closed it, tucking it back into one of his pockets. After we find him, I'll make sure to ask him plenty. Aizawa absorbed the man's words and felt a surge of gratitude. All right. The trio suddenly looked back towards the working papers nearby. Using what we learned, I don't entirely think he'd be up for. Mr. Ryujin trailed off as he opened the pamphlet. Babysitting, with quite handsome pay. Babysitting. Aizawa and Olivia seemed taken aback. Are you sure Isaac's a take care of child type of guy? Olivia quickly grew speculative, leaning in a little closer to gaze into the papers in Mr. Ryujin's hands. The man's lips curled upwards a little bit as he smiled. I don't think he'd turn down this. The trio all tacitly agreed at that moment to check the address for hiring. Mr. Ryujin immediately began to sharply scan the page for any additional information. After about 20 seconds of uninterrupted silence, his eyes widened as he pointed to a section of the page. It was labeled inside a separate box beside the hiring information. Apparently, Madam Charlotte Fitzgerald has been vying for a position in the papers for quite a while. Due to the long period of time she's been opening this position, Isaac was most likely to take this job without a second thought upon seeing the pay amount. Sounds reasonable. I'm sure he's the type of person to take the opportunity when the time presents itself. On top of the reward, the difficulty and resource have both been labeled as minimal. At that moment, Olivia's brows arched. Minimal experience, for babysitting. She folded both of her hands over her chest and assumed a more solemn position as if to amplify a point. If a person with no experience were to watch whoever the child is, they'd either struggle immensely or gradually learn as they go. That either signals desperation or confidence in the job done, Aizawa deduced, scratching his chin. I'm sure someone named Madam Charlotte Fitzgerald would have little knowledge in regards of how to raise children. Her house is probably crawling with servants. Then why hire to begin with if servants can get the job done? Olivia asked. Either sheer laziness or unconfidence in the servant's performance, Mr. Ryujin replied, leaning back in his chair. Laziness. Aizawa seemed taken aback. It may sound unorthodox, but maybe the servants don't do a good job either. If they did, she'd have no reason to put the job in the papers, the man with dragon horns speculated. After spending another 5 minutes putting pieces together and conducting arguments, they all unanimously agreed on heading over to the establishment to ask questions, disregarding the time of night. Putting on their coats and heavy gear, they headed back out the door and into the weather, which had gradually calmed down over time. It wasn't as potent as before, but wearing winter garments was a habitual precaution. As they walked down the street, Mr. Ryujin scanned the nearby roads to look for a rental carriage. A portion of the streets had been paved, so the chances of a rental carriage being available were higher than earlier in the night. I picked up this map from inside the lobby, and from the looks of it, walking to Madame Fitzgerald's establishment would take about an hour. That's another hour of Isaac without anyone. Or another hour of Isaac with someone we don't know. Gradually, Aizawa had begun to consider the possibility that I could have gotten kidnapped, so his persistence in gathering information had accelerated. The trio kept walking for a few minutes before the distant sounds of clicking against the snow-covered road. Mr. Ryujin quickly turned around and caught sight of the incoming carriage. The driver was a slim man with a broad forehead, and he led two brown horses down the road. Upon seeing the group, along with Mr. Ryujin's hand signal, he froze in front of them. "Need a ride?" he asked. Mr. Ryujin nodded, looking back and gesturing for them to climb into the carriage. To Madame Charlotte Fitzgerald's. The coachman quickly whipped the horses forward, sending them all down the road with great speed. Gradually, the sinking feeling in Aizawa's stomach began to dissipate. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author, Isaac7525, by link in description. The manor was akin to an abandoned building at first sight. All the lights were off from in and out, making it appear almost ghastly and haunted to the normal eye. As the snow continued to slowly drift down, Shinso, Oboro, and Florence all approached the front gates. Usually Gideon's at the front gate, Florence turned her head and looked to the right at the gate. There was no figure standing there, only a few neatly trimmed bushes. "How do you think we'll get inside?" Shinso asked, folding his arms over his chest. Florence fell silent for a few moments before her gaze drifted down to the boots Oboro was wearing. "Don't those boots let you jump really high?" she pointed. The blue-haired man nodded. "Yes, but unfortunately, I used most of their residual powers during the fight earlier." He raised his feet to give the duo a look at the soles. Inscribed on the bottom of the boots were numerous mystical patterns and sigils, and a faint, illusory azure light that gradually ebbed away. Just then, Shinso turned around. "I've read my fair share of mystery novels here and there. A house like this is destined to have some sort of extra entry point." He cocked an eyebrow. "In the time you've lived here, your madam never informed you of any." Florence swallowed the spit in her mouth and sighed. "Unfortunately, I don't think servants such as myself are permitted to know such things." "That's awfully reckless of her," Oboro commented, walking over to the front gate and wrapping his hands around the metal bars. He then planted his feet into the snow and tugged backwards against the gate. The metal let out almost ghastly groans upon Oboro's ministrations. "What are you doing?" Florence turned to him, her eyes widening slightly. The man ceased his actions after a few more tugs, turning back to the duo and scoffing. "I was measuring its stability." "Why?" Shinso quickly grew skeptical of the man's actions. His left foot absent-mindedly tapped against the snow-covered street below. Oboro took off his hat and tucked it away. "These gates appear to be made of copper, a material that is highly sensitive to water. Mostly copper, maybe ornate. Typical of a house like this, saving money for winter insulation or whatever the hell your madam likes to buy." The man then pointed to a small portion of the gate. The metal covering it had greened slightly around the edges. "This chemical reaction indicates it's breaking down." He continued to speak, walking left down the edge of the gate and running his palm along the metal bars. "Since water is melted snow, and the quantity of snowfall we've gotten this winter is high, it's bound to." Just then, he extended his right foot. A sharp clang rang out in the distant and quiet night as the portion of the gate was sent flying onto the snow-covered lawn. Eventually weakened, he turned back to the duo with a smile. Shinso and Florence remained frozen, but the boy's lips couldn't help but curl up in awe. Damn! Shinso's voice was barely above a whisper. The three of them entered through the broken section of the front gate, making their way across the snow-covered lawn. Their boots crunched against the snow, but another sound was able to register through it. Instinctively, Oboro and Shinso immediately turned around. Shinso's body went rigid when he caught sight of it. Standing behind them was a large, black and burly hound. Its neck was restrained with a large metal chain that was coiled around a wooden stake buried in the ground. The dog's muscles bulged beneath its thick black hide, and its mouth constantly leaked a thick trail of drool and foam. It let out a consistent, low, and rumbling growl as it bit at the air, feebly attempting to sink its teeth into either of them. Shinso's face paled as he took a step back from the dog. "I don't really like dogs," he whispered, flinching every time it bit at them. Oboro, on the other hand, remained still and silent as he gazed down at the animal with a calm expression. "Jasmine will bite your hand off if you dare pet her." Florence's voice carried an unnatural edge of warning with it as she stayed close to Shinso, who seemed uncharacteristically terrified of the animal before him. "She's a girl." Oboro turned back to Florence, his lips curling into a small smile. "Yes, not one you want to frolic with," she replied, taking a step forward towards him. "I wasn't planning on petting it, it's a guard dog after all." Oboro stepped back from the animal and turned around towards the front door. Suddenly, he was caught off guard by the abrupt sound of metal snapping, followed by a sharp pain in his left ankle. He quickly looked down and saw Jasmine sinking her teeth into Oboro's foot, tearing through his insulated gear and drawing up blood from the wound. Seeing this, Shinso's face grew colder as his eyes widened. Taking a few frantic steps back, he felt the urge to climb over the fence and dart away. The entire time, his gaze was laser-focused on the aggressive canine attacking Oboro. The dog's teeth suddenly loosened, and she took a step back with her tail wagging behind her back. But this action wasn't a genial one, rather, a warning. For a few silent seconds, Oboro carefully observed the dog's movement before him. She didn't lunge or attempt another attack, which he found peculiar. "She isn't moving, why?" Shinso's voice cracked slightly as he asked a fear-ridden question. "I'm no expert in dogs, but it looks like she's just trying to act tough to lure us away." Oboro remained still, but he avoided eye contact with the animal. Slowly taking a step back, he spoke in a low voice. "I'm not here to hurt you." His voice carried a small tremble, attempting to stifle the pain in his ankle from the bite. Oboro then removed his gloves from his hands and tucked them away as well. He knew that some animals could almost smell fear and desperation, so he tried his best to conceal any traces of his fear or pain. The last thing he wanted was another grievous injury. Oboro looked up at the duo and smiled indefensibly. "Try to enter the house." Shinso didn't budge, but his attention suddenly gravitated to one of the rooms on the second floor. Within the window, he saw a faint purple light, accompanied by muffled noises. His heartbeat accelerated in his chest at the discovery, but he didn't want to say anything to risk triggering the dog. The moment he stepped forward towards the door, he winced when the snow crunched beneath his boots. The dog suddenly turned around, her eyes almost glowing with unfiltered rage and provocation at the sudden stimulation. Shinso's eyes snapped shut, his heart beating erratically in his chest as he failed to let out a breath for air. Every muscle in his body seemed to tense when he heard the small pattering of the dog's feet against the snow, the animal charging towards him. Suddenly, the sounds ceased, and Shinso's eyes opened only a millimeter. Jasmine was sprawled on the snow, her stomach facing upwards as she gazed at Shinso. Her tongue darted out of her tongue as she wordlessly invited the boy to rub her stomach. What? Shinso choked out, opening his eyes completely to look at the animal. "I think she likes you." Florence's voice rang with astonishment as she observed the scene with a newfound smile. Wasn't she just attacking Oboro a moment ago? Shinso's body tensed again the longer he stared at the dog. "I think she registered us as threats at first. Now that we've posed no threat, I guess we're good to go." Oboro stuffed one hand in his pocket as he leisurely strode over to the door and rattled on the doorknob. He cursed under his breath and looked back at the duo. It's locked. Maybe there is a hidden entrance. Shinso walked over to the door and rattled it again to make sure it truly was locked. The doorknob barely moved. Should we check the back? Florence prompted, pointing around to the other side of the house. Shinso and Oboro tacitly nodded their heads in agreement. The trio made their way around the house, narrowly avoiding the countless marvels of architecture that lined the exterior. Upon catching sight of the backyard, Shinso and Oboro's eyes widened in astonishment. A large stone gazebo stood in the center. Around the edges of it were numerous white flowers and ice sculptures that melded with the snow color. I forgot to mention, winter is among Madame's favorite seasons. Her voice seemed to lower in awe as she stared at the aesthetic before her. Just then, her attention was gravitated to the sound of a sharp tug at a vine that slithered between the bricks of the house. The stone gazebo let out a low, mechanical rumble as it began to quiver and shake slightly, rustling the white flowers from their spots and tipping the ice sculptures over. A surface extruded from the middle of the stone structure, and the trio caught sight of an object faintly glistening in the crimson moonlight. It was a metal key. Curses! This house must be ancient if it has a secret mechanism. Florence walked over and picked up the key from the stone slab, holding it up to the duo. Come on, maybe we'll find him. Shinso's movements habitually sped up as he strode to the front of the house, attempting to conceal his giddiness as the door was unlocked. The moment he knew he could enter, Shinso burst into the house and scanned the surroundings. You're acting weird. Oboro cocked an eyebrow as he gazed at Shinso with a knowing expression. The indigo-haired boy let out a low curse as he quickly adjusted his demeanor. I'm just worried about him. He scratched the back of his neck, his cheeks flushing slightly. At that moment, he recalled the scene he had seen on the second floor. All of the lights in the house were off, except for that one room in particular. Using his judgment, Shinso knew that in most situations, the anomaly among the common was most likely the solution. He let out a low trembling breath as he approached the stairs, slowly climbing his way upwards. The closer he reached the top, the more a strange feeling stirred in his gut. Oboro and Florence followed behind him, and their expressions contorted too as if sensing the environmental changes. Something's off, Shinso commented as he reached the top of the staircase and carefully surveyed his surroundings once more. In a regular situation, he would have taken out his phone's flashlight to see properly. But due to the fact that he didn't have his phone on him, he had to resort to his base instincts. Making his way into the hallway, the boy slowly drew a breath of the abnormally chilly air around him. A trail of goosebumps formed on his skin as he walked forward. Habitually tightening his fists, he let out a shaky sigh. I know you're here. Just then, he felt a violating sensation in his lower regions. He slowly observed his pants tenting, and a sudden loss of breath in his throat as an overwhelming surge of arousal coursed through him. This was similar to the quirk test that he observed me endure a week ago, except this enemy was unseen unlike the robots. Oboro let out a low moan from his throat, only for Shinso to reach out and cover his mouth in a split second. Quiet, he hissed. The entire hallway fell silent, nobody was breathing or making a noise. Florence, are you all right? Oboro's voice was barely above a whisper as he turned around, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The sound of something hitting the floor in front of him caught his attention. In the faint lights, he saw Florence's body on the ground, a long trail of blood leaving her mouth as she gagged and coughed for a few seconds, before falling silent as her body went limp. The carriage continued forward on the road without any major delays. Outside, the trio could see that the snow had calmed down even more than before, slightly alleviating any concerns they had. Aizawa's fingers rapped against his knee as he slightly stirred in his seat. Olivia seemed to take notice of this, resting a hand on the latter's lap and offering him a small smile. I'm sure he's at the house. Trust me. Hearing the woman's reassuring words, Aizawa felt the contortions in his stomach gradually dissipate. Leaning back in his seat in the carriage, he sunk his head into the soft cushioned headrest and slowly let out a long, deep sigh. Mr. Ryujin had remained silent the entire trip. He didn't take out a romance novel he kept snagged in his pocket. Instead, His attention was fixated on the bloodied journal entries. Those 3 horrific sentences continued resounding in his mind, stirring up his focus. But what if he's not? He asked, looking up at the duo. He let out a low wince as a jab from Olive to his hip silently scolded him for asking such a question. You'll worry him, Olivia reprimanded the man, shooting him a glance as sharp as a knife. Right, sorry, Mr. Ryujin scratched the back of his neck as he gazed out the window. Suddenly, the 3 of them were sent forward by the carriage screeching to a halt. The horses leading them let out loud, fear-stricken sounds as if seeing something terrifying. The 3 of them all felt a pang of curiosity, which caused Olivia to stand up in the carriage and gaze out the front. There's people. Her eyes widened as she gazed upon the peculiar scene with an unsettled expression. Numerous men all clad in matching white uniforms were sitting in the middle of the road, their pupils glazed over as if in a daze. Olivia watched the scene for a few more seconds before ducking back down. Come on, she opened the carriage's side door and jumped down into the snow-covered road. Aizawa and Mr. Ryujin exchanged glances and tacitly agreed to follow her. The duo left the carriage and approached Olivia, who had turned to observe the men. Mr. Ryujin put a hand on his hip, his black tail slowly swishing back and forth as he asked a question. Why aren't they moving? Aizawa remained silent as he took a few steps forward. His gaze remained vigilant as he scanned the rooftops for any indication of an outside force. Olivia and Mr. Ryujin both watched him, their bodies frozen as if struck over with fear. They watched as Aizawa knelt down in front of a man with a stubble and a few missing teeth, which weren't hard to find, as they were lying on the ground around his body like trophies. Suddenly, Aizawa's eyes widened upon seeing the familiar glaze in his eyes. Brainwashing. The duo remained silent, but the air around them, and the way their expressions changed told Aizawa of their reaction to such information. This is Shinso's doing. Shinso, the purple-haired boy? Olivia asked, her eyes widening slightly. She had known the boy possessed a quirk, but she never knew that it was capable of. Aizawa nodded with a solemn expression. I don't know why he'd do this, or why he was out at this time of night in such bad weather, but I'll ask him after we find Isaac and Shinso. He suddenly turned back to the coach driver and cocked an eyebrow. What's the primary source of law enforcement in this kingdom? The pollinators. They work for the Church of Mother Nature. He replied, his gaze vigilant as he too was studying the unsettling scene. Tatsama, Aizawa addressed the man with the dragon quirk. Mr. Ryujin looked towards him and nodded his head. Get directions to their headquarters and inform them. He then focused his attention back to Olivia. According to the map, we're not that far from the house. We can walk from here. No problem, Olivia said with a small smile. The duo began walking forward, but they were halted by the sudden yell of the carriage driver. You forgot to pay. At that moment, Aizawa let out a low groan, his fingers rubbing his glabella as he turned around. Unfortunately, I don't have any money. Hearing his reply, the carriage driver's brows furrowed. His hand on the whip tightened slightly as he gritted his teeth. Why damn bastards. With a sudden thrust, he swung the item in Aizawa's direction. The man was instantly taken aback as he weaved away from the attack. What the hell is wrong with you? Olivia shouted, her brows curling as she too clenched her fists. I'm not a charity driver, I'm a money maker. He cried out. The man's logic made Olivia even more angry. She assertively stepped forward towards the carriage. That's not an excuse to harm a pedestrian. The woman swiftly extended her hand and snatched the whip from him, causing him to yelp as the action sent him forward onto the ground. He landed on the snow-covered pavement and rubbed his rear end at the impact. Aizawa took a step forward, planting a foot on his chest. My friend would now like some directions. Maybe on the way we can file for your arrest. Arrest? At that moment, he exploded into hysterical laughter. People here don't get arrested, most of them are either punished or sent to the asylum to rot away. Sent to the asylum. Aizawa was suddenly taken aback by his words. Yeah, dummy, the man scowled at Aizawa, before spitting upwards at him, only for it to land back on his cheek. Those who are mentally whack are sent there, and never seen again. Whatever, Feeling uncomfortable from the interaction, Aizawa quickly changed the subject. Now, his foot pressed down a little harder on the carriage driver's chest, causing him to inhale sharply. Where can we find the pollinators? 313 Minden Street. The largest cathedral in the city as far as the eye can see. He blurted out, the air struggling to leave mouth due to the pressure. Satisfied with the answer, Aizawa relented his grip and stepped back. We're still having you arrested. Not having money is one thing, but causing injury for it is another offense. Olivia turned to Aizawa, her gaze occasionally flickering back to the man. She leaned in closer, her voice a low whisper. Shouldn't we restrain him? Aizawa scratched his chin before nodding. His gaze flickered over to the whip on the ground. Its thong of the object was made of a thick rope-like material. He looked towards Olivia one more time before nodding. Aizawa slowly approached the whip and picked it up, shooting one more glance at the man. Hold still. Shinso remained frozen beside Oboro. Florence's dead body in the hallway had already strangely experienced signs of rot and decay. Shinso placed his hands over his mouth, breathing in deeply as he hyperactively scanned his surroundings for danger. Sweat was beaming down his body. If it were a different situation, one might think he was standing out in 100-degree weather. Oboro too remained silent, but he only held his mouth with one hand. The other was slowly reaching for the dagger he held in his coat pocket. Should we keep moving? Oboro whispered as he found the weapon. And risk ending up like her? Hell no. Shinso's voice raised slightly, trying his best not to attract unwanted attention. The entirety of the house was eerily silent, aside from the shaky breathing of the duo. Shinso and Oboro remained still in their spots, though the urge to move to a more secluded spot and seek less danger was slowly creeping up on them. The arousal in their lower regions hadn't dissipated at all, instead, it only seemed to grow the longer their positions were vulnerable. His face was already flushed a deep crimson, and his breath was short, but he wasn't sure on how much longer he could endure this before doing something embarrassing to himself. Something is doing this to us, Oboro said in a low voice, his arousal becoming prominent. I can't take it anymore. Shinso let out a low groan as he started moving forward, one hand tracing along the edges of the walls in the effort of finding an unlocked room. Oboro remained silent as a mouse, moving beside Shinso as he attempted to find a room to hide inside alongside him. Suddenly, Shinso felt a small alcove in the hallway, followed by the feeling of a small round object. Shinso trusted his instincts, immediately pushing open the door and slammed it shut behind them. In the dim illumination of the crimson moon filtering through the window, Oboro pressed his body against the door and held it back with all of his energy in hopes they wouldn't get caught. Find something to seal it shut while we plan. Oboro let out a strained whisper. The arousal in his pants seemed to be slowly disappearing since they weren't in the hallway anymore, but the effect still lingered to the extent of residual changes. Shinso nodded vigilantly, stepping forward. When he turned his head, he suddenly collided with something hard. This impact sent him back onto the floor, his hand darting to his head in an attempt to manually alleviate the injury. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness once more, he caught sight of something horrifying. A man with neatly combed black hair, a monocle, and a gold-trimmed suit was ensnared by thin strands of something he couldn't properly decipher. His mouth was left agape, and his head was slacked to the side. The man's eyes were wide open, the pupils petrified with stone-cold fear. His arms and legs were spread out like an eagle, except his elbows and knees were broken, snapped forward in brutal fashion. Some of these thin strands penetrated spots on his body such as his neck and hands, and warm, crimson blood slowly leaked where the injuries were inflicted. His gold-trimmed suit was in tatters, some of the garments were on the floor, but what took Shinso aback the most was his lack of pants and undergarments. He felt his stomach twist into a knot upon seeing the next thing. His genitals had been completely removed, a bloody, gore-filled hole was left where they had been torn off directly from the body. Thinking of such an event made Shinso grow nauseous. His face paled as a cold sweat broke out on his body. With trembling hands, he reached for the window and opened it in time for the torrent of vomit to leave his mouth and fall into the snow below. Oboro too observed the grisly scene, but he appeared more collected than Shinso. What do you think happened to him? He asked in a low voice. That thing that killed Florence probably got to him too, Shinso gagged, letting out a dry gag out the window as he stumbled back again. The urge to protect his lower regions had now grown to an extreme extent, his grip now vice-like around them as he gazed towards Oboro. Why, take them though. He pointed towards the bloodied area in between the man's legs. I don't know. But what I do know is that if Isaac is here, he most likely. A sharp slap from Shinso halted Oboro from finishing his sentence. In the faint light of the crimson moon outside, he could see the tears gathering in the corners of Shinso's eyes. Don't you dare say that! He shouted. A cold, bitter sensation rushed over Shinso as he immediately covered his mouth with his hands. In the corner of his eyes, he saw a shadow dart past them, rushing to another corner of the room. Shinso's body remained frozen, though it carried a slight tremble to it as he awaited his fate. The boy's heart sank to the depths of his body the moment he heard a guttural feminine chuckle sound behind him. With the carriage driver properly restrained, Aizawa and Olivia headed down the road with the map in hand. According to their current location in the kingdom, the industrial district with a less dense population, the duo could anticipate arrival soon. Olivia looked back to the restrained driver, who had been tied to the wheel of the carriage. She let out a low sigh as she turned to Aizawa. He mentioned asylums here. Wasn't that woman we helped earlier an asylum patient? Aizawa nodded his head. The woman who took her away said she was, but the old woman wasn't wearing a uniform unlike the men in the road. Wasn't she wearing a coat? Maybe we just didn't see under it. Olivia quickly made a deduction as they rounded a corner. As they continued to walk, the volume of smokestacks atop the complexes gradually faded away, replacing with ordinary slanted rooftops, closed restaurants and citywide establishments. This portion of the city was much like the area around the Parterre des Fleurs, lined with homes and shops. For the most part, the people in the surroundings had mostly receded into their homes, resting peacefully. Most of the houses were small yet comfortable looking, run down to a certain extent but still possessing a satisfying structural integrity. Why think Madame Fitzgerald lives around here? Olivia asked, her eyes scanning the surrounding streets as she surveyed each of the houses carefully. Aizawa remained silent, scanning the houses and restaurants lining both ends of the streets. I don't think she'd live in such an unsuspecting mansion, Aizawa replied, numerous thoughts coursing his mind. Whilst UA mostly taught the fundamentals of becoming a hero, the second most logical procedure was to teach them courses and subjects of a regular school on top of it. The last thing they wanted was for heroes in training to lack the necessary intelligence, only possessing the skills of the battlefield and strategy over a basic knowledge of mathematics and English. When Aizawa had begrudgingly taught Class 1A about the Victorian era, he had brought up numerous historical documents, papers, and videos detailing the economic difference between the rich and the poor of a society like this. The rich always sought lavish mansions in richer sections of the city, whilst the poor and middle class were condemned to regions of collective housing. At that moment, he couldn't help but chuckle. We're probably in the wrong location. After finding the nearest street sign, he darted down and looked at the map of the entire kingdom. From their current spot, the location with the highest chance of Madame Fitzgerald living there was only a few blocks down. He raised his hand and pointed down the road. If this map is entirely accurate, her house should be in a location out of this neighborhood. Olivia nodded, taking the map from Aizawa and stuffing it into her pocket. I'm sure we don't need this, something tells me we'll know which house is hers. Aizawa considered the woman's words for a brief moment before nodding his head. All right. As they continued walking forward, their gaze drifted to the sky, noticing that the snowflakes had gradually slowed in their descent. You mentioned something about Oboro earlier tonight, Olivia piped up. At that moment, the man's entire body seemed to tense up upon hearing her words. His blood ran cold as he turned his head to look at her. I did, he replied, not trying to deny the situation. Olivia paused for a beat, her expression carefully studying Aizawa, who had turned pale and broke out into a sweat. Are you okay? She asked, her expression softening slightly after catching onto Aizawa's mental state. He looked away from her, sighing softly as his voice carried a slight tremble. No. Since you first saw Oboro you've acted differently. You're stiff, shaky, and you never stop looking at him. As if her words were a curse uttered by a witch, small tears formed in the corners of his eyes, which he defensively wiped away with his sleeve. Me and him go back further than what you've seen. His voice was a low whisper as his voice trembled, bordering on crumbling completely. But, you've only been with him about a week. No. Aizawa's voice lowered to a whisper as he turned away, rubbing the back of his neck slowly as he began to speak once more. Oboro was my friend when I was in high school. He was among the first people to approach me and offered me friendship. Following that, we were almost inseparable, along with my other friend, Hizashi, who you know as the teacher present Mike back at UA. More moisture formed in the corners of his eyes as the hand rubbing his neck began to shake. It was our first hero mission. We were tasked with protecting kids from a collapsing building. He then looked towards Olivia, a single tear running down his left cheek. He was crushed by the rubble saving them, and I was too damn weak to save him. The man extended his leg and kicked a cluster of snow sitting in front of them, scattering the powdery white substance across the road. Now that he's here, that Isaac sent us here with whatever ability he has, I can't dare to lose him again. I don't want to lose anyone close to me. I still have to protect all of you. Unexpectedly, Olivia tensed the moment she felt Aizawa's arms wrap around her, pulling her into a gentle yet firm hug. He pressed his head into her hair, inhaling the shampoo she had used recently. I may have only known you for a short while, but I already feel like you're one of the closest people in my life. Hearing his words, Olivia's lips curled into a smile as she returned the hug, pressing her body against his. I promise you I won't leave. She looked up at him, her eyes carrying a faint edge of tiredness as she continued to smile. Ever. Aizawa's lips curled into a small smile as he let go of the woman. His face flushed around his cheeks as he rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. We can cut the pleasantries for a moment, we have to find them both. Olivia's movements down the road grew more deliberate as she kicked aside the accumulated snow down the road. Aizawa followed beside her, slowly observing as the houses along each side of the road disappeared, gradually transforming into larger houses with spiked metal fences and neatly trimmed, snow-covered foliage. Damn it, Olivia mumbled, gazing upon this new section of the neighborhood. Every house looks the same. Look, Aizawa approached one of the street lamps, snatching a paper strapped to its post. He approached Olivia with the paper in hand and showcased it to her. This is the advertisement for the babysitting job. It shows her house in this painting. He pointed to the bottom of the page. A small painting was stamped onto the paper, showcasing a clear look at Madame Fitzgerald's establishment. It doesn't look much different than anything else here, Olivia commented, holding up the paper to the crimson moonlight. Well, this neighborhood is a square according to the map, so we won't have much difficulty finding it if we analyze each one closely. Suddenly, they heard a noise in the distance. Olivia and Aizawa turned their heads, their eyes widening in unison as they caught sight of a burly-looking black dog running in their direction. It let out a low whimper as it stopped at Aizawa's feet. A long chain was strapped around its neck. At the end of it was a dislodged wooden pole that dragged behind it as it ran, causing a thin trail to form in the snow. A dog? Olivia asked, puzzled. Just then, the animal spun in a circle, letting out another low whimper. The animal froze for a moment before suddenly lunging forward and sinking its teeth into Aizawa's shoe, tugging insistently. It wants us to follow it, Olivia observed. Without a second thought, she stepped forward and gazed down at the dog. Seeing her, the dog let go and began running in the opposite direction, occasionally looking back at the duo to ensure they were listening. Aizawa and Olivia exchanged a glance, the man feeling a surge of skepticism at the suggestion. Maybe they're both in danger. Aizawa ran forward, accompanied by Olivia as they pursued the dog down the road. They ran past most of the houses in the neighborhood before stopping by the house they had seen in the photo. Aizawa's analytical yet frenzied gaze immediately drifted to the portion of the gate which had been dislodged from the rest, resting on the snow-covered front lawn. At that moment, he felt a surge of panic. It's broken. Olivia turned towards the section of the gate, nodding her head. Either someone broke in or broke out, maybe it was Shinso looking for him. Maybe that's why he was out at that time, and that's why the men were brainwashed. The man didn't hesitate, he ran through the gap in the fence and towards the front door, which had been left open. Olivia followed closely behind, pausing the moment Aizawa froze in the doorway. The crimson moonlight leaked in through the front door, spilling into the darkened hallway. Aizawa darted into the house without hesitation, his intuition telling him that the abnormality wasn't a good sign. He ran up the stairs and into the hallway, his gaze barely able to penetrate the thick darkness. The boy didn't have time to react, failing to turn around in time to see his attacker. Oburo's eyes widened with fear as he watched the female figure leap at Shinso with inhuman agility, pinning him to the floor as she raised her talon-like hands and began to swing and claw at Shinso's throat. Shinso's hands held the figure back from making direct contact, her hands were just out of reach from the thin, delicate skin of his throat. Letting out a low groan of effort, he landed a kick to the figure's chest, sending her back into the corpse suspended from the ceiling. "Come on!" Oburo shouted from the doorway. During the brief confrontation, Oburo had already made an attempt to escape the unseen attacker. Shinso glanced at the direction of the toss, only to see that the figure had disappeared from view. His hairs stood on end upon seeing this, and his blind instincts took in. The boy immediately turned towards the door, bolting out into the hallway and slamming the door shut. The entire hallway was shrouded in silence, which was barely penetrated by the duo's shaky breathing. "Don't tell me my mother hired more of you," a male voice sounded in the darkness. Shinso's heart tightened as he instantly turned in the direction of the voice, swinging at the air with a sharp slap. Raymond let out a sharp wince at the contact, his head recoiling from the assault. "Do you have the manners of a Neanderthal?" "Shut up," Shinso hissed, covering Raymond's mouth with his hands. "If you damage anything in here, my mother will have you thrown in prison," Raymond scoffed, his voice muffled and obscured by Shinso's hand. "Tell that to the man we found inside that room," Shinso whispered, pointing to the room beside him. "I know, I witnessed it firsthand with my siblings," the boy replied, crossing his arms. "Did they end up like him?" Raymond shook his head. "I locked them in my study to ensure their safety." "Did someone named Isaac come here?" Shinso asked. Raymond nodded. "Yes, he was hired by my mother to watch my brother, Bertram." Hearing his words, Shinso felt the anxiety in the pit of his stomach increase tenfold. "Is he safe?" "That's unbeknownst to me." Raymond scanned the surroundings for a few seconds, only for the silence to be broken by Oburo. "Then why aren't you accompanying them?" Oburo asked. At that moment, Raymond pried himself away from his grip and chuckled. "They aren't the ones with mystical abilities. You're also a meta." Shinso was caught off guard, momentarily pulled away from the current situation by Raymond's revelation. "My siblings are unaware of the fact, neither is my mother or the servants. Since you'll be killed by the Trimbris, I figured why not tell you," Raymond replied with a smile. "Trimbris?" Oburo asked, pulling the duo back into the room with the servant's corpse to learn more. "Creatures depraved of morals, only controlled by their insatiable lusts. I'm honestly surprised that I didn't realize my servant Florence was one the entire time." "Florence? Isn't she dead?" Shinso's eyes widened. "Her corpse is down the hall." Raymond crossed his arms. "Then I guess that Trimbrises can also shape-shift and steal identities to a certain degree. Can you help us find Isaac?" Shinso asked, stepping forward towards Raymond. Raymond adjusted the collar of his pajamas and sighed. "I won't assist you in that, but I can hold off the Trimbris whilst you look for him." Hearing the offer, Shinso let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you." Just then, the trio heard a terrifying screech coming from outside. Raymond instantly opened the door and leapt to the side in time to dodge the attack from the Trimbris. The demonic woman instantly phased from the shadows, gaining her physical form as she leapt off the walls and towards Raymond. Shinso watched the fight, almost entranced as Raymond continued to dodge and weave the attacks with ease. He was suddenly tugged back from his position, rousing him from his daze. "Oh my god," Aizawa let out a low sigh as he wrapped his arms around Shinso from the back, letting out a long sigh. "Aizawa." Shinso looked up at the man, momentarily confused by the sudden appearance of the familiar figure. "Yes, me and Olivia both went out to look for Isaac, but we realized you had a similar predicament. If you're here, I guess we have a similar goal." The duo didn't need to exchange any more information, tactically nodding and running down the hallway side by side. "Let's check downstairs first." Aizawa, Shinso, and Oboro all darted down the stairs, hanging a left and entering the foyer of the manor. Upstairs, the trio could still hear the ongoing fight. In the dim lighting from the crimson moon, mixed with the door which had been left open, they could see a large portion of the foyer. "Do you think there's a light switch around here?" Shinso asked, turning in Aizawa's direction. "This isn't like our world, so we'd have to find another way to light up this place," the man replied, vigilant surveying his surroundings. "The lamps are kerosene-powered, you'd have to light them yourself with the oil reservoirs within the lamp," a hushed voice sounded behind them. The trio felt their hearts leap as they sharply turned around. Standing behind them was a boy of about 12 years old, messy brown hair, and wearing pajamas. It was Wilfred. Upon seeing him, Aizawa instantly recalled seeing the figure inside the apartment complex. He was one of the servants who served them dinner. "You're that servant at our apartment." Aizawa knelt down and spoke softly to the boy. "Come on." Wilfred suddenly grabbed the collar of Aizawa's shirt, tugging him down the hallway. "Isn't that one of Raymond's siblings? Didn't he say that he kept them in his room?" Shinso turned to face Oboro as they ran down the hallway. "Hey, kid," Oboro prompted, running up beside him. The shorter boy looked up at him, his grip on Aizawa's collar loosening. "Why'd you disobey your brother?" At that moment, Wilfred ran over to one of the kerosene-powered lamps, flipping up a metal flap in the steel base. Within the compartment was a small amount of oil. Wilfred then reached into his pocket and took out what appeared to be a small match. "Maybe if we light up the house, we'll weaken the monster." Wilfred moved vigilantly, his movements quick and precise as he reached into the lamp and extracted the wick. Following this, he turned back and began to tutor the others. "Let the wick soak in the oil for a short period," he instructed, doing the same whilst his attention was gravitated to the trio rather than his own ministrations. He had done this hundreds of times before, the most common scenario of lighting his candle to use the bathroom. Shinso and Aizawa moved quickly, soaking the tip of the wick in the oil, slowly dipping it in and out to ensure the time of soaking wouldn't be dangerously slow. Following the wicks being soaked to satisfaction, they looked back to Wilfred. "Now place the wicks back in their spots, then turn the knob." They all did as instructed, picking up the wicks from the oil and positioning them within the holders. They then scanned the metal base of the candle holders, before finally finding the knobs. On 3, Wilfred's eyes narrowed. 1, 2, 3. Wilfred and the others all turned the knobs. They all closed their eyes in anticipation of the blinding light, but they didn't see or hear any changes. Oboro peeked an eye open, surveying the surroundings whilst his brows furrowed slightly. Nothing changed. At that moment, the man let out a yelp as an invisible figure pulled him back. "Oboro!" Aizawa bolted forward, darting down the hallway regardless of the visibility. Oboro was the beacon of his current situation, the only reason he would even consider running in such conditions. His hands habitually darted for his binding cloth, but his heart sank upon realizing its absence. "Shit," he growled, speeding up. Oboro writhed and clawed at the invisible grip on his shoulders, even sinking his teeth into the unseen hand. But nothing serious changed in the entity's demeanor. Aizawa and Shinso watched as he was dragged up the stairs and down the hallway. The duo didn't hesitate for a single moment, pursuing the unseen entity in the shadows. They continued down the countless corridors of the manor, weaving past pillars and bookshelves. The unseen figure suddenly extended one of their limbs, pushing over a bookshelf in Aizawa and Shinso's direction. The duo leapt back in time to dodge the assault. When the shelf landed, the collision echoed throughout the entire manor with a low rumble. Once the dust settled, neither Oboro or the unseen figure were nowhere to be seen. Godumnit. Aizawa pounded his fist against the wall, stumbling back and glaring down the empty hallway. He just disappeared like that. Unlike Aizawa, Shinso seemed momentarily confused by the action. Yes, and so did Oboro. The man barked, facing Shinso with widened eyes and a cold sweat. Seeing him, Shinso's eyes widened slightly. He had never seen Aizawa in such a condition before. Calm down, we'll find him, Shinso's voice lowered to an almost comforting whisper. He refrained from touching the teacher, as the gap in sheer strength between the two was akin to a mountain. At that moment, one of the nearby windows burst open, letting the crimson moonlight shine through the curtains, which had been blown apart from the frigid winds. In the now dim lighting, Shinso's eyes widened when he caught sight of numerous illusory footprints etched into the carpet. They shone a deep orange color, and they were a few times bigger than a regular footprint of a human. You see those? Shinso pointed down at the carpet. Aizawa's eyes, which had glossed over slightly, managed to focus on the sight. Maybe that's them. The possibility struck Aizawa like a hammer to his skull. Raymond leapt back again in time to dodge the attack from the shadow woman. Her yellow eyes were fixed on his form, hypervigilantly scanning his every move and decision. A strange sense of cold filled the air, but the boy brushed it off in time to counter the next set of moves. At that moment, the treacherous woman leapt down from the ceiling, focusing a barrage of attacks in his direction. Raymond instinctively leapt back again, before raising his fists and landing a punch to her right cheek. The impact sent the treacherous back a few feet, but she recovered her equilibrium in time to kick Raymond in the chest. The boy coughed up a faint amount of blood from the force of the attack, but his lips curled up, showing his meaty, pink gums. Suddenly, he stomped his foot on the ground, conjuring a faint black mist that quickly permeated that specific section of the hallway. As the mist flowed through the air, the malicious look in the treacherous's eyes seemed to falter and die out. Seeing this, his smirk widened as he quickly reached into a hidden pocket of his pajamas and extracted a sharp knife. His grip tightened until his knuckles were white, and the boy instantly shot forward, raising his hand to land the decisive blow. Just then, the treacherous woman regained a semblance of rationality, gazing at Raymond and performing an action in the next half a second. An illusory, rope-like stretch of shadow extruded from her palm, piercing through Raymond's lower gut. The boy let out a pained yell as he stumbled back, collapsing to the floor. In the dim lighting, he spotted the dark red blood bleeding through the green silk of his pajamas. His vision began to darken around the edges, and a wave of nausea overcame him. He watched as the dark mist in the air gradually receded back into his body, slowly sealing the wound and healing the injury. Even with the ongoing process, Raymond felt like he would lose consciousness at any second now. The treacherous woman leapt forward once again, jumping off the walls as she conjured up another rope-like shadow. This time, it landed directly through Raymond's left arm. The boy's eyes widened as he grit his teeth, stifling a scream. Her lips formed an inhuman smile that stretched to her eyes as she unleashed another one, this rope-like shadow branching into 3 more sharp weapons that pierced the rest of his limbs. Raymond was now completely incapacitated, his eyes rolled back and showing only the whites. He felt his body being lifted into the air, although the sensation was hazy and beyond his usual senses. In what was left of his senses, he felt the white-hot agony of the tendrils pumping deeper into his tendons and muscles, coiling to the base where the bones connected beneath the corresponding layers. The boy let out an inhuman scream as he felt his body slowly being torn apart by the treacherous. With a final, quick surge, she severed all his limbs from his body. Blood, organs, and bodily tissues were splayed in every direction, painting the hallway in a canvas of red. The carpet below had also been darkened from the macabre scene. At that moment, the treacherous heard an inhuman laugh echo in her ears. She watched, her eyes widening as the organs, bodily tissues, and remnants of his demise all disappeared, turning into a dark, illusory smoke. The smoke gathered in a particular spot in the hallway, reforming back into Raymond's form, now donning his black and purple vest from earlier. Seeing this, the Treembrus let out a shrill, banshee-like scream and shook the entire manor to its core. The scream echoed off all the walls, causing the bricks and marble to visibly ripple as if they were composed of a thin liquid. Raymond's gaze flickered to the wall, enraptured at this sensation. A sudden surge of arousal engulfed his being as his pants tented below. The Treembrus remained silent, yet it moved like a phantom in the shadows. The illusory woman leapt up, before slashing downwards directly onto Raymond's face. The boy didn't have time to react. He let out a low growl as the warm blood coursed down his face and into his eyes. The sensation stung away, causing him to raise his head and wipe away the blood. Whilst distracted, the Treembrus took the opportunity to crawl behind him, lifting him up from behind. With a guttural, inhuman chuckle, the Treembrus walked over to the railing overlooking the foyer, before tossing Raymond downwards, his body hitting the marble tiles with a clamor. Wilfred, who had been silently watching the encounter from the first floor, covered his mouth as he darted back to his room, slamming the door behind him. Frantic tears streamed down the boy's face as he silently began praying. The duo froze in their spots when the illusory footprints stopped in front of an old wooden door. In the crimson moonlight that filtered through the curtains, the duo saw that the old door had been left ajar. They turned to each other. Shinso swallowed the lump in his throat as he made his way and opened it more. In front of the opened door was a long staircase that descended downwards into an inscrutable darkness. Along the wooden walls on either side of the staircase, they saw numerous candles that appeared a few eons past their date. As he took another step into the space, Shinso felt the floorboards quake underneath his boots, causing him to habitually step back and carefully analyze the situation. The last thing we want to do is inform the creature of our location. At that moment, a deafening roar echoed in their ears. The duo quickly raised their arms and defended their hearing. In the dim lighting, Shinso and Aizawa caught sight of the wooden and marble surfaces of the manor rippling as if they were composed of a thin, runny liquid. Underneath their feet, the floors rippled too, causing them to stumble back. What the? Shinso appeared at a loss for words. Aizawa, on the contrary, assumed a more skeptical opposition. Did that creature do that? The walls and floors only reacted in such a way because of her roar. Shinso fell silent, gazing back at the open door. I think so. He took another step forward. This time, Aizawa noticed a few changes in his posture and demeanor. Shinso's foot tapped the ground gently, and his shoulders stiffened as he gazed down into the darkness. The darkness before the boy was deep and foreboding, something he assumed even a candle's light couldn't penetrate. Are you okay? Aizawa asked, stepping forward next to him. Shinso slowly drew a shaky breath as he gazed at Aizawa. What if he's not down there? Aizawa felt a small tinge of empathy. He raised a hand, which also seemed to tremble, and placed it gently on the boy's stiff shoulder. If he and Oboro aren't down there, if they've been taken by whatever that beast is, we'll get its head. Hearing his words, the boy's attitude silently shifted. His shoulders relaxed, and the tiny quivering in his top lip slowly faded away. We need light though. When we tried to light the candles with Wilfred they didn't activate. Perhaps it was that demon's fault. Suddenly, Aizawa seemed to get an idea, as his brows arched upwards. Letting out a shaky breath from his lungs, he stepped forward, one foot landing on the first step descending. His trembling hands reached out and grasped the candle which was suspended in the doorway. The moment he did so, it activated with a small flame. How did you know that would work? Shinso's eyes widened in slight astonishment. Aizawa's lips curled up into a somewhat smug smile as he led the boy down the stairs. This smile wasn't one of total smugness, but rather alleviation of the current mood. I thought of my erasure quirk. It only works when I'm in someone's field of view. Once they run away or hide, they can use their quirk. So, you suspected surfaces outside of the demon's domain wouldn't suffer negative effects. Shinso's breath hitched in his throat as the walls gradually receded in their respective directions, and the space around them enlarged. Just a logical dedication, Aizawa continued forward, holding up the candle in his hand. In his other hand, he dove into his pocket. The air around them was cold and clammy, accompanied by a foul smell of what appeared to be mold. The wooden floors beneath them were wet, some panels rotted away entirely from the excess moisture hanging in the air. Somewhere in the room, they heard the faint sound of rustling, though they didn't pay much attention to it, blaming it on a small rodent. The man raised the candle even more, exposing the stone ceiling above them. Some sections were caved in entirely, chunks of the stone surface falling to the floor. Suddenly, Shinso let out a yelp as he tripped on a block of stone that had been dislodged from the ceiling. He landed on the rotten wooden floor with a clatter, the force of the impact dislodging even more of the wooden panels and sending them up into the air. As one of the floor tiles flew into the darkness, an obscene sound of squishing filtered through the musky air. Hearing this, the duo instantly paused in their tracks. The candle's light seemed to flicker slightly from the air current in their direction, but it didn't burst out. Aizawa extended his hand, offering Shinso assistance in getting back up. What was that noise? Shinso rubbed the back of his head where he had landed, gritting his teeth at the numb, aching pain that began to swell like a blister. Aizawa didn't reply, his posture straightening as his eyes narrowed vigilantly. His grip on the candle tightened as he began to walk forward into the darkness, and towards the source of the sound. As the duo made their way deeper into the abnormally large cellar, the stench of rotting materials filtered through their noses at an uncomfortable degree. Shinso gripped his collar with whitened knuckles, pulling it up past his nose to block out the smell. The dark-haired man didn't react. He continued walking forward without paying the stench much mind. At that moment, Aizawa paused in his tracks when the roof of his head brushed against something above him. Its texture was cold, wet, and slimy. He felt a frigid, thick substance that resembled a sort of gelatin splash down onto his head with a sickening squish. The man's eyes darted up to the ceiling, taking an instinctive step back. When he raised the candle to get a better view, he saw a massive object suspended from the ceiling by a thick black tendril that resembled a rope. It appeared to be a mixture between an egg sac and a cocoon. Its surface was black with a slight purplish accent within the scale-like schisms in the surface of the object. Its surface slowly writhed and crawled in a sickening way that made both Shinso and Aizawa's skin crawl. Within this sac-like object, they spotted a silhouette of a figure bobbing up and down slowly in a translucent liquid. Within the liquid, they could see what appeared to be small bugs. Suddenly, a muffled yell tore through the sack as the figure's limbs began to tug and push away at the edges of the sack. Within the translucent liquid, the tiny bugs began to scatter and crawl around frantically at the sudden environmental changes. Aizawa didn't waste time. He leapt up into the air and wove the torch around the rope-like appendage connecting this sack-like structure to the ceiling. Following that, the sack fell to the floor with a sickening pop as it exploded in all directions. The thick black shell of the sack-like object was splayed out across the walls and floors of the cellar. The small bugs that had crawled within the translucent liquid quickly scurried away into the small gaps in the wooden floorboards. And the semi-translucent liquid within the sack spread out across the floor, sticking to Aizawa and Shinso's boots like a macabre imitation of glue. Don't hurt me," a voice sounded in the darkness in the spot where the sack had dropped. Aizawa lowered his candle to properly see the figure's form and features. He was coated in the translucent liquid. Wearing black pajamas, he had medium-length brown hair with black ends, a pair of messy, glossy glasses were halfway on his face, and a bandage was wrapped around his forehead. "It was me. Oh my God," Shinso's voice rang with an uncharacteristic relief as he bent down and held my form. My eyes were half-lidded as they adjusted to the faint light of the torch. My ears had been clogged by the liquid, and I was currently engaged in a fierce battle of not vomiting from what I had experienced. Shinso. Within the darkness I caught sight of the faint outline of the boy, his indigo tufts almost instantly recognizable. I didn't recognize the figure behind him who was holding the torch, but I was glad he had assistance with seeing in the dark. Yeah, it's me," Shinso said with a smile, his grip around my body tightening a little as if afraid to let me go again. Beneath my silk pajamas, I could feel his hands trembling as they clutched the fabric. My entire body reeked of the liquid within the cocoon, but that didn't seem to bother Shinso in the slightest. He even lowered his head, pressing his forehead against mine as he whispered, "Tell me before you leave next time." We then heard another crash. It was similar to the sound of my cocoon falling to the floor. Me and Shinso turned our heads in unison, catching sight of another sack-like structure falling to the floor with a splatter. Instead of begging for mercy, we were greeted by coarse and ragged coughing. Whoever it was didn't seem to hesitate in embracing the person within the sack, even if their body had been ruined by the transparent liquid inside and making their form all sticky and vile to the touch. "Oboro," Aizawa's voice lowered to a whisper as he held the coughing man in his grasp. The blue-haired man seemed taken aback by the somewhat intimate contact, but he refrained from any sudden ministrations. "Let's get you out of here." Shinso quickly picked me up, hoisting me over his shoulders like a sick dog as he darted towards the stairs beside Oboro and Aizawa. The moment they opened the door, Aizawa reacted in time to dodge the Trimbris's attack. In my blurry vision, this creature appeared like a shadow rather than a female figure. Oboro and Aizawa stood ready for battle. What shocked me the most was that Oboro recovered so quickly. "Get away, as far as possible." Aizawa turned in our direction and gave an order. At that moment Shinso looked down at me, his brows furrowing in blatant concern. "Come on, let's get you outside." He ran down the hallways with almost inhuman speed, dashing into the foyer. The boy suddenly froze in his spot as his feet glided slightly against the polished marble floor. In my blurry vision, I saw what appeared to be a bloodied figure on the floor, a small pool of blood forming around their limp body. "Shit!" Shinso cried out, twisting his body in time to dodge the attack from the Trimbris. The shadowy lady turned back around in a flash, cocking her head in an instant. She extended her right hand, ready to unleash more rope-like attacks. Suddenly, the floor beneath us began to tremble violently. In my blurry vision, I watched as what seemed to be like vines protruded from the marble floors, wrapping around the arms and neck of the Trimbris. She let out a deafening shriek as the vines bloomed colorful flowers. The flowers smelled of radiant scents, filling the air with an atmosphere that deeply contrasted the current situation. The perks of the flowers began to rotate as they emitted a thin pink mist into the air around the figure. She writhed and barked helplessly in the restraints. I watched with curiosity as her eyes slowly drifted close, her body falling slack as she succumbed to a forced state of slumber. The front door suddenly opened, and a man with long blonde hair, a broad forehead, and a wooden box in hand stepped inside. The surface of the box was inscribed with numerous patterns that resembled plants. "Restrain her," his voice was cold yet collected. He watched with an impassive look as two men suddenly burst into the room, carrying small handguns. They quickly undid the Trimbris from her vine-like restraints and let her body fall slack to the ground. The blonde man turned to the two of us as the men prepared her for travel. "A Trimbris, eh?" Judging by the way his lips curled up faintly, he had great difficulty concealing his amazement. As the Trimbris was properly restrained with mystical bondages, the two men hurried her out the door. Suddenly, the man with long blonde hair shifted his gaze to Raymond's pitiful form on the ground. "Medical team, I need you on site," he commanded. At that moment, a small group of people all clad in white and green uniforms ran through the open doors, approaching Raymond's unconscious body. They quickly unbuttoned his shirt and surveyed his injuries. Near the bottom left of his abdomen was a red welt as if someone had struck him with a blistering hot object. On the top of his chest beside his heart was another wound similar to the one below it. On his shoulders and thighs were deep red and black injuries with protruding tissue and grotesque amalgamations. "It's like his limbs had been torn off," one of the doctors, a man with a broad forehead, commented after observing the boy for a few moments. "Patch him up," the blonde captain said. Upon hearing the order, the doctors and attendants became more vigilant. They quickly opened the medical kit, which looked like something completely foreign to our previous world. Inside were numerous long needles, herbs, and tiny vials with liquids inside them. One of the doctors took out a particularly long needle from the bunch inside the kit. She slowly lowered it into the injury on Raymond's right shoulder, which looked more bent out of shape than the other ones on his body. After she had injected the transparent liquid, a strange green growth engulfed the injury. The crimson, raw tissue was quickly submerged with plants and foliage. The greenery sprouted flowers that emitted a faint pink mist into the air. As the mist coursed through the room, it spread to the other injuries on his body. The less noticeable bruises and cuts quickly healed themselves, and the tears on his left shoulder and legs quickly sealed themselves shut completely. Upon a quick completion, Raymond slowly opened his eyes, coughing as he slowly moved his body. His expression slowly morphed to confusion as his eyes adjusted to the faint lights of the crimson moon. "You can thank me," a voice sounded behind me and Shinso. Our bodies tensed, but Shinso gathered the strength to turn around. We caught sight of Mr. Ryujin, looking at us with a half-baked smile. For the most part, he seemed concerned for my current condition. "What happened to you?" he asked, extending a finger and running it along my forehead. The transparent substance stuck to his finger, and he hesitantly extended his tongue to get a taste. The moment he made contact, his entire body seemed to shrivel up. "I was stuck in a cocoon for the last few hours. That Trimbris took me there," I explained, my eyes half-lidded as a wave of exhaustion from the night's events washed over me. Caption: We've surveyed the rest of the house and found the rest of the family. The madam and her servants, well, almost all of her servants are in satisfactory condition. A man with a beard, accompanied with a burly appearance and broad shoulders, strode into the foyer from upstairs. "You can just say they're alive, Ralph." The man with long blonde hair sighed, rubbing his glabella. At that moment, he turned to look at the two of us. "You encountered a Trimbris, a rather peculiar demon. I'm honestly surprised you two made it out alive." Shinso's cheeks burned up slightly, and he rubbed the back of his neck with his free arm. Mr. Ryujin removed me from his back, strapping me around his shoulders. "I mean, the second worst thing was the dog in the front yard," the boy made a sheepish joke in an attempt to lighten the mood. "May I ask," the captain pointed to my now unconscious form on Mr. Ryujin's shoulder. "What happened to him to make him so revolting?" "We found him in some strange cocoon downstairs," Shinso explained. "A cocoon?" He cocked an eyebrow. "Bring me to it." Shinso opened the door to the cellar, plucking a candle from the wall and heading down into the darkness. The blonde-haired captain followed him, one foot striding in front of the other with a refined elegance that clashed with his demeanor. It appears of forgotten formalities. "My name is Brindo Moffin, but you may address me as Captain Moffin. I'm the captain of the Pollinators, one of the organizations within Seraphis Kingdom." Shinso silently registered the name in his mind before sighing softly and continuing. As they walked deeper into the cellar, the air around them grew colder. Suddenly, the candle Shinso was holding flickered out. "Shit." Within the darkness, Captain Moffin's lips curled up as he unfurled his palm. A peculiar, small brown box with engravings suddenly lit up. The lid opened, and a short blue flower erected from inside, its petals and stem radiating a soothing glow. "Amandina petals, you can find them in the East Fields," Captain Moffin said with a small smile. Some time later, the blonde-haired man froze in his tracks, his gaze gravitating upwards in the direction of something hanging from the ceiling. Upon raising the glowing petals, he caught sight of its complete form. The sack-like structure was suspended from the ceiling by a black tendril. The outer shell crawled with small bugs within its skin, and inside of the sack was a small creature, its form slowly being devoured by the tiny organisms inside it. When he caught sight of this, he took out a small knife and sliced the tendril on the ceiling, causing the sack to land on the floor and unfurl. At that moment, the pungent odor of rotting flesh quickly filtered into the room, filling the air with a malignant stench that even made the captain wince at first. Once the dust receded, the duo was taken aback when they saw the body of a cat sprawled on the ground. Bits and pieces of its form had been eaten away by the small bugs, revealing layers of bone and tissue underneath its thin white fur. "Demon maggots," the captain observed the numerous white organisms scatter underneath the floorboards. He then turned back to Shinso, raising an eyebrow. "Assist me in collecting them." "What?" The boy's face paled, taken aback by the order by the captain. The blond man turned around to face Shinso, prompting his hands onto his hips. You claim your friend was in a similar state, yes. If that's true, we'll need to analyze the maggot's interior composition to ensure they didn't consume any of his flesh. Shinso's face paled as a wave of disgust washed over him. Why couldn't we just look for bites on his body? The captain sighed gruffly and continued speaking. Demon maggots aren't like the regular specimens. Their bites burrow beneath the skin where you can't see them, and they can lay their eggs in the most unsuspecting places. Shinso stumbled back. The thought of me or Oboro contracting eggs under their skin was enough to make him want to tear off his own skin and dart outside. He felt a nausea accumulating in his stomach burst open like a macabre dam, forcing him over onto his knees as he unleashed a torrent of vomit onto the moldy wooden floor. Seeing this, the captain slowly let out a sigh. Up now. My teammates are busy at the moment with the other people in this house. Shinso gazed up at the man with glazed eyes, the unsettling glint in his dark pupils unsettling him further. Since he knew that these were the pollinators inside of the establishment, refusal of orders from the captain of all people would most likely result in some sort of punishment. The boy coughed up some more before he completely stood up, surveying the dark basement for a few more seconds. Captain Moffin walked over to one of the wooden panels, which had turned a grisly green color from decomposition and mold. With bare hands, he lifted the wood. Shinso felt his skin litter with goosebumps as he turned away from the sight. You're using your bare hands. Captain Moffin nodded his head. Being a seeker of the vitality pathway, you naturally gain specific pheromones and properties that render you unable to contract or suffer from disease. That makes it sound like demon maggots are a normal thing. Shinso slowly walked over to the floor panel, kneeling down as he took a pair of gloves from the man. As he slipped them over his hands, he raised his collar over his mouth as he inhaled deeply through his mouth and nose. Are you sure you wouldn't like a mask? Captain Moffin turned to look at him, cocking an eyebrow. Shinso scoffed inwardly and shook his head. Due to the positioning of the lapels, accompanied by the insufficient lighting of the Amandina petals, he knew the captain was unable to see the blush on his face. The last thing he wanted to appear was a coward around him, not a reluctant boy who had been given a grotesque task. The captain lowered his hands into the large cluster underneath the floorboard, scooping them up and dumping them into a jar. Shinso immediately felt like he was about to pass out upon realizing that was his task. Don't be a toddler, the captain looked in his direction, scoffing. Shinso's body immediately went rigid when he felt the man's vice-like grip take a hold of his wrist, forcing his arm downwards into the bunch of maggots. Shinso bit his lip so hard he knew he'd bleed the moment he felt the bugs writhing and crawling on the gloves. That wasn't so bad, was it? His lips curled up into a mocking smile as he patted Shinso on the back. The boy remained silent, unable to speak properly from the experience. That's all? He asked in a low, trembling voice. Nope, the captain replied, pointing to the floor tiles across the cellar. Upstairs, Mr. Ryujin was situated in the kitchen of the establishment of Oboro and Aizawa. The three men were silent for the most part. Aizawa's hand traced soothing circles along Oboro's back, loosening the tension. I never wanna go back inside there, Oboro groaned, lowering his head onto the table with a sickening splat. He was still covered in the transparent substance, but he had received assistance from the pollinators in cleaning up for the most part. What was it like in there? Aizawa asked softly, raising an eyebrow. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, I could only feel and smell that awful liquid, and the feeling of those damn bugs crawlin' all over me. The blue-haired man absent-mindedly scratched at his arms and legs as he spoke. The sensation of the bugs was akin to an insect bite that itched non-stop. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. Aizawa's voice lowered even more, a small amount of moisture accumulating in the corners of his eyes as he sighed softly to himself. The grip on the man's back habitually tightened, in an almost protective manner. Don't blame yourself, Aizawa. Blame that damn demon woman for all of this bullcrap. He was trapped too, but he's asleep right now. Mr. Ryuan looked back at my form on his shoulders. My lips were parted slightly as I buried my head into the crook of his neck. I had also been cleaned to the maximum they could supply, but I still smelt of the sustenance, and I was still dripping to a certain extent. The sound of footsteps echoed in the chamber as one of the pollinators entered the kitchen area, her eyes scanning the trio at the table, along with the boy on his shoulder. Her hair was tied into a neatly rested bun on the top of her head, and her cheek and jaw bones were prominent along the edges of her head. We've harvested useful samples for research. If you feel comfortable, you all may go back to your houses. Never again. Shinso burst into his apartment room and collapsed onto his bed, clutching the sheets tightly, which whitened his knuckles. When he had returned to the parterre de fleurs later than the others, it was well into the wee hours of the night. The crimson moon shone through the linen curtains, casting an eerie glow onto the entire room. Above his head, he heard the gushing of pipes as they circulated water throughout the entire building. Suddenly, the bathroom door opened behind him. I slowly walked out, clad in nothing but a towel wrapped around my waist. All of my outfits are dirty, and I think my coat and stuff are back at Madame Fitzgerald's, I groaned, collapsing onto my bed on the other end of the room. I just got back from collecting creepy-ass bugs with the captain of the pollinators. Shinso's voice carried a slightly whiny edge as he grumbled, burying his head into his hands. Bugs. I cocked an eyebrow, leaning up in my bed. Why yeah, these demon maggots we found within the cocoons in the basement of her house. You and Obero were inside them, so we had to collect them to check for human DNA. Why would they need my DNA? I leaned up even more, my body stiffening slightly. Probably checking you for diseases or something. Shinso collapsed back onto the bed, letting out a heavy sigh. Upon hearing his claim, I felt my blood run cold. The amount of time I had been within the Trimbris sack was beyond my current perception. If it were long enough, perhaps I had contracted some sort of malignant disease. Did the captain give you any information about the disease? I asked, my voice rising in pitch. I felt the air gradually leave my lungs, and a feeling of lightheadedness rushed over me like a tidal wave. This caused me to fall back into my bed, staring up at the ceiling. I'm supposed to stop by the cathedral tomorrow to gain new information. If you have contracted the disease, you'll most likely be rushed to the hospital. At that moment, there was a firm knock on our apartment door. Shinso's half-lidded gaze drifted to the source. His legs quivered slightly as he stood up, slowly walking over to the door and opening it. Standing at the door was a man a little taller than Shinso, with long blonde hair that cascaded past his shoulders, a prominent jawline, and pupils reminiscent of deep pools of water. It was Captain Moffin. In his left hands, he carried the outfit I had donned before Florence changed me, and in his right he carried a small wooden box. I assume this belongs to your friend. When Captain Moffin tossed Shinso my outfit, a purifying smell gushed into the air. The outfit's fabric had darkened slightly, and it dripped onto the floor. It's still wet, we washed the Trimbris essence off of it earlier, he explained, his voice carrying a no-nonsense solemnity. Is that why you stopped by? Shinso turned to face the captain and asked a question. He shook his head as he stepped into the apartment room. The floorboards creaked underneath his heavy, polished black boots. This time, his outfit was more resembling a commoner rather than a member of an organization. Captain Moffin removed his cap from his head and stowed it away into his double-breasted coat. You were among the ones found within the Trimbris sacks, yes. The moment his dark eyes focused on my form, I felt my body tense up. In this strange daze, I nodded my head in confirmation. Is he scared? The captain took notice of my reluctant body language and whispered to Shinso. I don't know, he's always acted this way around figures of authority. Just then, Captain Moffin's expression gradually shifted, taking on a more genial and calm demeanor. No need to be frightened, I don't intend to harm you. He took a step forward, slowly extruding his arm in my direction. We have a few things to discuss. Shinso, who had been watching the entire interaction, stepped between the two of us. Look at him, he's tired as hell. He pointed to the dark circles around my eyes, which were bloodshot around the edges. My skin had turned pale, which was detrimental due to the fact that I was clad in nothing but a towel at the moment. Within my surroundings, the walls and floors appeared hazy, and the two figures before me gradually turned blurry and inscrutable, as if my eyes were cameras losing focus. The corners of my vision darkened, illusory black cracks slithering down to the middle. Just then, I fell back in my bed, succumbing to a brutal slumber. Seeing this, Captain Moffin sighed softly, stepping back towards the doorway. While this interaction was pivotal, I believe rest is the best option. Pivotal. Shinso walked to the doorway, leaning back against the frame as he looked the captain up and down. Makes it sound like it's serious. Are you sure you can't just ask me questions? The captain adjusted the notched lapels of his coat and held up the box and opened the lid. Inside the box was a bottle of transparent fluid. This is a sample of the Trembris sac fluid. If it does contain his DNA, he'll show telltale signs after he ingests it. You want him to drink this stuff. Shinso snatched the bottle from the captain, his grip vice-like as he bored into his eyes. The indigo-haired boy's voice lowered to an almost protective whisper. Do you know what'll happen if it's not his DNA? Are you sure there aren't other ways to test this fluid? The flurry of questions in his direction were like a heat that caused the captain to sweat. He raised his arms, wiping away the accumulated moisture with the cuff of his coat. In a world with hidden existences and dangers, sometimes, you must throw caution to the wind to protect yourself and others. He snatched the bottle from Shinso's hand, before slamming the boy's wrist against the doorframe with an iron grip. The boy tried in vain to escape, but he failed to do so as he was handcuffed to the hinges. What the hell? Shinso growled, his vision turning a blistering red as he saw the captain walking over to my unconscious body. His wrists habitually tugged and pulled against the cuffs, and his legs planted into the wall. The closer he got to my body, the more his movements grew in insistence. He watched helplessly as the captain unscrewed the bottle, pouring a small amount of the liquid into my mouth. The liquid grew hazy and unfocused on my tongue, gradually morphing and changing as if undergoing some spontaneous change. Shinso watched as the transparent liquid diffused into the form of numerous small maggots resembling the ones under the floorboards. They settled on my tongue for a few brief moments before gradually turning transparent and crawling down my throat. At that moment, my body began to twist and writhe slightly on the bed. Across my body, numerous blisters began to sprout on my skin like a fungus, and an immense rush of heat poured across my unconscious form. My eyes shot open, rolling back and showing the whites. My tongue lolled out of my mouth as more pores sprouted on the spongy skin. The sickly pale color of my skin gradually darkened, turning an almost abysmal gray color. Shinso watched in horror, sweat beaming down his forehead as he continued to pull against the handcuffs. At that moment, his vision turned a hazy orange, and something in his pocket buzzed. When he looked down, he spotted the pocket watch which had manifested earlier that night. The corners of his vision darkened, but he didn't experience any signs of fatigue or a worsening condition. The watch continued to buzz, the sensation intensifying the longer it happened. When Shinso looked back to the scene in a panic, he noticed all the colors had become more saturated than usual. Strangely, there were some peculiar changes. Both of the forms in front of him were outlined with a mysterious aura. The aura around the captain was a mixture of purple and black. The aura was rippling and pulsing. The illusory, complex sight of bugs crawling beneath the skin of the captain's aura sent shivers down his spine. My aura was tainted with a mixture of red and black, though the sensation of the bugs wasn't as heavy. When he looked back at the captain, Shinso was suddenly overcome with a sensation of nausea. The man's spiritual aura had begun to dissipate, edges of green gradually creeping towards the center of the man's body, his heart. At that moment, his material body began to twitch slightly. The moment he noticed that, the green aura exploded with illusory maggots. The tiny bugs slithered up into the man's eyes, nose, mouth, or any other passage of entry they could find. Shinso struggled more against the cuffs, his fists clenching enough to leave tiny crescents in his palms. The twitching of the captain's body continued, then he suddenly dropped to his knees. The blonde-haired man let out a yell as he clutched his hair with his hands, pulling away at the strands. At the same time, my form had also undergone a few changes. The color shifting of my skin had ceased, but the blisters littered across my body receded as if they never existed to begin with. Shinso watched as the maggots crawled out of my body, making their way towards the writhing captain on the floor. The moment the two entities connected, his eyes shot open as he stood up with inhuman speed. His hands ripped out a good portion of his golden locks, the tufts gently drifting to the floor. The captain's eyes drifted in Shinso's direction, the pupils focused and mad on the indigo-haired boy. His knuckles clenched so hard they turned a ghastly white. At that moment, his body suddenly collapsed inwards on itself. His back began to twitch and ripple as a pair of bug-like wings emerged, causing a torrent of blood to sprout alongside the winds, splattering against the walls. His eyes bulged to an inhuman capacity, before exploding into black orbs resembling a bug's eyes. His hands curled inwards, new tendons and limbs shooting out of his sides and extending outwards. His mouth disappeared, and a pair of malicious fangs and pedipalps tore through the skin. The newly transformed captain let out a deafening sound resembling a roar. In Shinso's vision, the spiritual aura had diffused into a rotting green color with an abhorrent amount of spiritual maggots crawling all over it. At that moment, a revelation shot through him like an icy chill. He's been infected by the demon maggot disease. The watch in Shinso's pocket buzzed insistently, as if wanting him to take action. Shinso, still unable to move, watched in horror as the newly transformed captain clicked its fangs together, the sickening sound of the captain's squishing and clicking echoing throughout the room. He was taken aback with terror the moment the captain lunged at Shinso, extending its 6 bug-like appendages in his direction. Wasn't Captain Moffin a seeker of the vitality pathway? Did he verify himself that he wouldn't succumb to corruption and risk a dangerous outcome from touching the demon maggots in the cellar? Without much time to answer those questions or make a reasonable guess, Shinso extended his loose foot and kicked him in the chest, sending him backwards. When he collided with the wall and fell slack, his body began to twitch and move involuntarily. Suddenly, he looked up and let out another shriek, before turning his head towards the closed doors of the apartment balcony. With a quick burst of motion, the captain thrusted forward, the wings on his back extending as he broke open the doors and flew out into the snowy weather. After a short while of locomotion, the captain's movements grew slow and sluggish. The wings on his back, along with the arms on his sides, gradually froze over with an icy sheet. Shinso finally slid himself free and darted over to the balcony, peering out at the figure in the air. The captain then dropped downwards with a lifeless grace, his bug-like head slicing into a metal fence post, causing a fountain of blood to gush upwards into the air. He let out wanton shrieks and screams at the excruciating pain, before finally falling limp and silent. Seeing this, Shinso didn't waste any time surveying the scene, along with the captain's spiritual aura. When he gazed downwards into the streets, the captain's aura had turned an illusory, transparent white hue. Whilst not knowing much regarding spirituality, Shinso deduced this was a sign of death. His body was slack, the snow slowly covering his form. The insect-like wings on his back twitched weakly in protest of his own demise. In the distance, Shinso heard the sound of a dog barking, either at the unfamiliar figure, or something he couldn't exactly know about. He then turned in my direction, seeing that my form had stopped twitching on the bed. My expression was soft and placid, my lips parted slightly. In the crimson moonlight protruding from in between the clouds, Shinso took notice of my skin. It was still a dark shade of gray, and a few of the pores that had previously formed were still latched to my skin. The pores twitched and throbbed with what seemed like a mind of their own. Seeing this, Shinso's eyes widened. Damn it! He cursed under his breath. He removed the blanket from my body and tossed it aside. When he pressed his hand to my forehead, he let out a low grunt when the palm of his hand was greeted by scalding hot temperatures. My fingers twitched and moved involuntarily, as if I too sensed these changes in my body. The entire time his spiritual ability was activated, which allowed him a valuable insight into my condition. The illusory colors around my body had turned black and green, though the shade of green wasn't like the captain's, it was lighter. The boy either took this as a good or a bad sign. After falling silent for a few seconds, he looked towards the door, which had been closed. Did anyone hear what happened? They would have heard the shrieks and immediately entered this room to investigate. Feeling a surge of peculiarity, Shinso stood up from the bed and approached the door before opening it and stepping into the dark hallway. Either side of the hallway had been darkened, only the red light from the moon filtered in through the linen curtains. He stepped forward, feeling the soft carpet against his bare feet. His next course of action was simple enough. He had to get the others and have them watch over me whilst he handled matters regarding the captain's mutation. Rap rap rap. Shinso knocked on Aizawa's door with an uncharacteristic sense of urgency. A few moments later, the door opened. Aizawa, who was clad in nothing but a pair of pants, rubbed his eyes groggily as he gazed at Shinso. "Did any of you hear that?" Shinso asked. The black-haired man's eyebrows twitched. "No." Hearing this, the boy quickly dropped the subject. "Isaac isn't doing too well, mind watching over him whilst I handle something?" "What's wrong with him?" Aizawa's voice lowered. "I don't know exactly, just do as I say." Shinso was reluctant to address Aizawa in such a way, but due to the peculiarity and urgency of the situation, he didn't refrain from ordering him to do something. The boy headed downstairs into the lobby. For the most part, the entire space was silent, aside from the distant hum of the generator beneath the floorboards in the basement. The water pipes grumbled in the ceiling, circulating water throughout the space. Shinso mustered the strength to step through the front door of the apartment complex, trotting into the snow. Either side of the road, which was now illuminated by the kerosene-powered street lamps, was dead silent. On the far side of the road, Shinso caught sight of the corpse of the captain, which was now leaking a brownish liquid and emitting a faint smell of rotting. His bug-like mouth was wide open in a silent scream. The metal fence post stuck through his forehead, the tip covered in the brownish liquid. On the tip of the fence post, Shinso also spotted what seemed to be brain material and bodily tissue. His limbs still twitched slightly on his still body, the remaining arms on his side were slack, the fingers already submerged in the snow. The boy looked both ways down the road, silently scanning for an oncoming carriage or horse. On both sides of the road, there was nothing but the empty road and the street lamps dimly lighting the road ahead. The road stretched into the darkness, gradually shrinking back into the snowfall. Shinso's boots crunched against the snow as he crossed the cobblestone road, approaching the corpse of the captain. His blonde hair had been entirely torn off, the surface of his shiny head entirely surfaced over with the glossy sheen of bug scales. Letting out a low sigh, Shinso looked to his right, scanning the rooftops of the city in hopes of catching sight of the cathedral. After a few seconds, Shinso spotted the building described as being the tallest in the kingdom. It stuck out among the other rooftops, the pointed top erecting past the others, extruding at a height that might have touched the clouds above his head. Upon knowing his destination, Shinso rolled up his sleeves and took hold of the man's head, slowly raising it upwards out of the fence post. The sickening sound of flesh tearing echoed throughout the street as the head found respite. With a pop, Shinso removed the head and allowed it to fall slack like the rest of its body. He then took hold of one of the captain's many arms with both of his arms, ensuring he was careful not to damage his current form. The texture of the arm was akin to touching the arm of someone who hadn't shaved at all, except the hair was covered in tiny spikes that felt like barbed wire. The skin underneath them was cold and clammy, almost like solidified gelatin. The boy began to walk forward, hauling the corpse of the man behind him. The cold body continued to leak a brownish liquid behind him as it was moved, leaving a trail like a telltale sign of relocation. The snow continued to pummel down gently as he dragged the body down the street. The entire time, Shinso's teeth were gritted, his whole being engaged in a Herculean conflict to not discard the body and go back to bed. But at this moment, he had to let the pollinators know of this situation, that their captain had fallen to this infection. If I had succumbed to the same situation, he had to find a way to alleviate it. When he approached the cathedral, the building seemed to stretch upwards for an eternity. Its pointed roof looked like it could scrape the sky. Shinso hauled the corpse onto his shoulders as he opened the front doors of the cathedral. The stone doors were immensely heavy, letting out a deafening creak as the interior of the cathedral came into view. Among the countless rows of pews, an uncountable amount of candles were lit, glowing with a gentle yellow hue. Within the pews, vines adorned with flowers gently slithered out and into the alleyway as if they possessed a consciousness. At that moment, a hidden compartment behind the altar opened, causing the wooden floor to split open like a cavern, revealing a staircase. The staircase descended into darkness. Unlike the manor, more candles on either side of the chamber lit up, allowing him ample enough light to descend without much problem. Shinso's breath hitched as he began to walk downwards, the wooden stairs creaking as his boots pressed against them. When the boy arrived at the bottom, he was instantly greeted with the sight of what looked like a hidden lab similar to Aaron's. Lining the dark chamber were numerous pots of flowers. One of the flowers was sealed under a glass case, its petals an ashen gray color. The head of the flower spread open to reveal numerous rows of razor-sharp teeth. Suddenly, the flower's forked tongue shot out, snapping against the protective glass case. The moment the two forces collided, the flower seemed to let out a noise of disappointment upon realizing it couldn't break free. "One of our marvels," a female voice sounded from the darkness. At that moment, a figure walked out. She had long brown hair tied into a bun above her head. Her eyes were a deep brown color, and she was clad in a white and green robe similar to the ones the other pollinators were wearing back at the manor. "Who may you be?" she asked, leaning her head to the side. Shinso didn't respond. Instead he dropped the corpse on his back onto the floor. The entire cathedral seemed to fall silent as the woman's eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice laced with fear. "That's Captain Moffin," Shinso said, pointing down at the corpse. "Why, what?" She seemed too stunned to speak. The woman strode over to the corpse, picking it up with gloved hands. Shortly after, she turned back to the darkness. Within the darkness, a light suddenly flashed on. The space which was darkened was now lit up, revealing a myriad of operational equipment accompanied by an operational table. "James!" she yelled. A door in the chamber opened, and a boy with neatly combed hair, wearing a gentlemanly suit, walked out. He looked a little older than Shinso. His dark eyes locked onto the figure, and his solemn expression gradually diffused. "We're already dissecting the Trimbris, now this abomination." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. At that moment, the woman turned back to Shinso. "We'll attend to him shortly." Shinso remained silent, his face paling slightly. "You have the Trimbris here." She turned around, completely facing Shinso. "This is the first sighting of a Trimbris in almost 5 years. We'll need to dissect it to study its anatomy for research purposes." The boy wasn't ready for a lesson. He took an authorized step forward whilst looking at the captain. "I heard something about demon maggot disease from him." She nodded. "Demon maggot disease. It's something we know frighteningly little about. So, you don't have a cure." At that moment, Shinso felt his face pale, and a cold sweat overcame him. She shook her head. "No, we don't. Though, we're currently developing them using the Trimbris DNA." The woman pointed to the side, where Shinso saw numerous test tubes bubbling with a black, viscous liquid. "We believe due to the devilish nature of both organisms, we can intergenetically connect the cells of them both and protrude an antibiotic shortly after." "Well, what if I told you I think one of my friends might be in the early stages of it?" Hearing this, her lips parted slightly as she hauled the captain onto the operating table. "Pardon." Shinso nodded his head. Before he lost control, the captain put some of the strange demon maggots onto his tongue. Before he transformed, they left his mouth and reunited with his body. Shinso's explanation seemed to send chills through her body. Earlier tonight, he and a division were sent to investigate a strange case regarding patients in the middle of the road. She reached into a drawer and extracted a few pieces of medical equipment. Shortly after, they gravitated to Madame Fitzgerald's house after sensing a negative spiritual presence. Me and him collected samples of the demon maggots in the basement of the house. In the basement, we also found strange cocoons, a few of them contained my friends. Well, she turned back to him. Where are your friends at the moment? I believe Obero's back at his apartment, while my friend is inside a room at the flower apartment about a block from here. The parterre de fleurs. Shinso nodded. I recommend you hurry. The boy then turned around and headed up the stairs, the crimson moonlight filtering through the multicolored stained glass windows of the cathedral, casting the interior in a variety of hues. Shinso looked up at the elegant figure inscribed in the stained glass. She was a plump woman made of stone, with vines and foliage crawling up her body. Vines stretched downwards to form her hair, and her 2 eyes were made of gemstones. Shinso made his way back into his apartment room, catching sight of Aizawa sitting by the bed. He then noticed I was sitting up with a pained expression on my face. What's wrong? Shinso's expression furrowed as he approached the bed and sat down beside Aizawa, who wore a concerned expression. My stomach feels weird, I grumbled, clutching my lower abdomen. Beneath my hands, the duo could see the surface of my stomach rippling and contorting as if inflating and deflating like a balloon. Seeing this, their expressions hardened. I called a few pollinators over here, they'll help you out. Hey, at that moment, I couldn't help but laugh self-deprecatingly. I never got paid by Madame Fitzgerald, I'm just glad she's happy. My body leaned back into the pillows. The corners of my vision were still darkened around the edges, with illusory cracks creeping towards the center. When Aizawa entered the room, one of the first things he did was take note of my peculiar appearance. Due to my weakness, I could only partially open my eyes, so I mostly relied on audible descriptions. From what I had heard, my skin was dark gray like a corpse with a few warts. My eyes were bloodshot and had dark circles. If I were to walk into the streets, I'd probably have some organization on my back thinking I was a dead man walking. So the captain burst out the door and collapsed into the street. Aizawa turned to Shinso and asked a question. He did, though, it's weird you never heard. Aizawa scratched the back of his head. I guess I was too tired from all the bullshit that's happened tonight. The entire thing with demon cocoons and demon women. Even amidst the current situation, Shinso couldn't help but smile. I don't blame you. But, you're not the only people in the apartment, I noted, my voice hoarse and dry. Damn it, you're right. Someone must have heard something. Then why didn't many people in this apartment wake up and check to see what happened? Shinso questioned. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. We all turned towards the door in unison, and Aizawa was the first to stand up. The man walked over to the door and opened it, catching sight of a small group of pollinators. Among them was the woman and the teenage boy from earlier. Without saying a word, the group shifted into the room and approached the bed. How is he feeling? The woman asked, turning towards Aizawa. He's been weak since I came to see him not that long ago, he replied, resting his hands on his lap. James, the brown-haired lady called the boy over. This time, he was clad in attire similar to the other pollinators. In his hands, he carried a small cup of herbal tea. As he brought the tea to my lips, Shinso turned to the group. Why didn't you immediately react to your captain losing control? At that moment, the woman turned to look at Shinso, sighing softly. Demon maggot disease, along with other happenings tonight, are all linked to the demon pathway. Are you sure you should tell them this information? They aren't seekers, a man with darker skin spoke up, standing in the doorway. Actually, I am, Shinso said. The woman's brows furrowed slightly. What? Upon realizing what he had said, Shinso felt the urge to jump out the window and run away. Damn it. Don't worry, kid, she said, her previous demeanor eerily changing. You're just an inexperienced child. If it were someone more profound with mysticism or someone linked to a secret organization, we'd have you apprehended on the spot. Hearing her words, the indigo-haired boy was suddenly engulfed in confusion. You're assuming my condition, are you not? The woman's smile widened slightly, and she felt the urge to laugh. If you were a seasoned seeker, you most likely would have engaged in combat and walked out with some sort of injury. I apologize. A burly man with curly black hair approached the bed, peering down at the brown-haired woman. Ms. Jasmine here is somewhat inexperienced with this sort of thing. It's best that she remains the surgeon of the division. He bent down, whispering coldly into her ear. Ms. Jasmine's eyes widened with fear as a trail of goosebumps littered her skin. Why yes, Captain Silas. She gulped, refusing to make eye contact with the figure. Captain. Aizawa cocked an eyebrow. Captain Silas looked towards Aizawa, his expression cold and calculating as he looked the taller man up and down. After your friend brought Captain Moffin's corpse into the cathedral, I was immediately promoted. He then turned back to Ms. Jasmine, scoffing. If this church bell over here kept gawking and told you some things, you all would have surely lost control. The brown-haired woman looked away from him, staring into the floor as she let out a shaky sigh. I'm sorry, dear. Hearing the word, dear, Shinso immediately had some guesses. Could this duo be engaged? Though he wanted to ask, he found that it would be rude considering the rules and standards of a world like this. Shortly after a brief silence, Ms. Jasmine stood up from her seat. This has been a peculiar visit. Now I must be back to the cathedral for the autopsy, she said, her smile twitching slightly as she left the room. The muscular man with curly black hair stood up beside her, placing a large hand on her shoulder as he guided the woman out of the room. This tea will temporarily help any ailments, but it doesn't mean they'll completely disappear, James commented, stepping back from the bed and bowing. What now? Shinso asked, arching an eyebrow. Aizawa looked in James's direction, slightly eager to hear the answer. This demon maggot disease is something we don't know much about, so your friend here will either have to undergo severe medical transplants or be condemned to a medical facility elsewhere in the kingdom. Hearing the two options, the duo felt their blood run cold. From what he had learned from historical studies, Victorian-era surgeries weren't the most sanitary or safe way of getting the job done. They were mostly performed in dirty conditions and were littered with a plethora of problems. On the other hand, having me sent to a medical establishment like a hospital was also risky, though the reasons were more intimate. All of the pollinators in the room suddenly turned to look at me. We'll leave the decision up to you. You'll have until daybreak to decide. James then turned towards the door, looking towards the dark-skinned man. After Humphrey receives your answer, he'll transport it to us, and we'll commence with the proper procedures. Shortly after that, all of the pollinators except Humphrey left the room. The dark-skinned man adjusted his outfit and sat down in a chair beside the door. Don't worry, kid, I won't watch you sleep. He reached towards the bookshelf, taking out a thick romance novel. Wanna hear about this strange-ass thing that happened earlier tonight? Humphrey's lips curled up into a smile. I wouldn't mind it, I said hoarsely. The man gave a satisfied chuckle. We had a man named Ryujin burst into here, telling us about something strange he found in the middle of the road. He suddenly pointed out the doors. Downtown near the industrial zone, we found a bunch of asylum patients sitting in the middle of the street. We also found a carriage driver tied to the wheel of his own vehicle. At that moment, Aizawa looked away awkwardly. Shinso's breath hitched in his chest. Aslium patients? I asked, my eyes widening. Seraphis Kingdom holds an asylum downtown. Due to the medical budget being overturned by the Food Stability Act a few years ago, we had to move everything from the medical facility into the asylum building, but have it constructed as a different section of it. Hearing those words, I felt my blood run cold. If I were to choose the decision to hold myself in the medical facility, I could risk a possible run-in with a crazy person. Can the two interact? I choked out. To a certain extent. The only patients deemed somewhat lucid are allowed to walk around freely during a specific time frame. Aizawa turned back around, cocking an eyebrow. If they're somewhat lucid, why aren't they just let free and monitored? When he took in Aizawa's question, the man flipped open the novel and licked his finger. Only the administrator knows the answer to that. Humphrey suddenly chortled. Or maybe not, he runs half the operations in the kingdom. At that moment, the door suddenly burst in. Olivia, wearing different attire than previously, burst into the room. Aizawa, come outside real quick. The man let out a low sigh as he stood up, walking out of the apartment room and entering the hallway. He positioned himself across from Olivia, crossing his arms over his chest as he leaned against the wall. Yes. Olivia reached into the pocket of her coat and took out the strange vial they had gotten out of the choking woman. I did some research in the catalog, and I think this is a drug. A drug? When he heard Olivia's inquiry, Aizawa felt a pang of suspicion. What makes you assume that? Diaresis. The blonde-haired woman looked down at the floor below, her face flushing slightly. Let's just call it an articulated guess. She then took a hold of Aizawa's shirt sleeve and led him down the hallway. The duo headed down the stairs and out of the apartment. Olivia looked back at Aizawa, clearing her throat. We'll be heading back to that restaurant and asking them about this thing. The tiny overhead bell rang out as they stepped into the restaurant. Strangely, the group of men Aizawa had previously intimidated were sitting there, sipping their drinks leisurely. They all turned to look at them as they entered, but upon seeing Aizawa, they noticeably paled and looked back to their drinks. You're back? The scrawny bartender asked, arching an eyebrow. Yeah, we're wondering if we could speak with your boss, Aizawa said, looking towards him. He was a man with red hair and blue eyes, clad in gentlemanly attire alongside a stiff collar and bow tie. His body consisted of a lanky, almost malnourished build. Freckles dusted his cheeks, which were also coated in a faint amount of blush. The boss? He asked, adjusting his bow tie. He's in his office. He pointed down behind the rows of tables, revealing a door with a metal sign on it. It was plated with gold and silver, with the words, Mr. Cecile, inscribed within the plating. Just knock before entering. He's a regularly calm man. Aizawa and Olivia slowly approached the door. When they were in appropriate proximity, Aizawa saw Olivia visibly tense. Knowing she wouldn't do such an action, Aizawa knocked on the door. Behind the door, they heard a gruff voice with an accent allowing them entry. The black-haired man opened the door. They caught sight of a man with a stubble across his lower chin, and neatly combed yet slightly greasy hair that seemed to shine in the overhead lights. There was a small bandage over his left eyelid, which none of them questioned. Though he looked intimidating, his expression was one of relaxation. Shall I offer you two a drink? How's some Bordeaux sound? He gestured towards the counter, which had a bottle of reddish wine. Unexpectedly, Olivia nodded her head. That sounds good. Mr. Cecile let out a low chuckle as he walked over to the counter, pouring him and Olivia some of the beverage. After he walked back over to the desk with the wine glasses, along with the bottle, in hand, he sat back down and sipped. Now, mind telling me the reason for this visit? Mr. Cecile asked, absent-mindedly spinning the bottle in his other hand. Aizawa suddenly caught sight of words inscribed on the paper wrapping around the wine, which usually indicated the type and flavor. Patented by Maison de Santé Asylum. I won't bother to decipher the first part of the name, but that wine says it was patented by an asylum. Aizawa looked at the boss in the chair. Ah, I see you've never known our kingdom is a cornerstone of French culture, eh? Mr. Cecile chortled, sipping his wine once more. Strange, why would an asylum make a wine brand? Aizawa's question diffused into the air of the room, silently intoxicating Mr. Cecile and making him fall silent. The man put the bottle of wine underneath his desk and smiled softly, his gruff voice sounding once more. Maison de Santé Asylum is the sort of place to do all kinds of stuff with their patients. I heard rumors that the patients who aren't screamin' and bashin' their heads against the walls produce the wine. From what I'd guess, it's most likely a method to prevent them from going insane. Hearing these words, the duo's minds began to bubble with numerous questions. Olivia, who had remained silent and finished drinking her beverage, pushed the glass aside and asked a question. Where is the wine sold? In the underground market of Seraphis Kingdom, Mr. Cecile replied, pointing below the wooden tiles of the floor. Like a black market. Olivia was taken aback by this revelation. No, no, no. The man with the stubble and neat suit chuckled softly to himself, adjusting the lapels of his jacket. It's just the market where products that the average patron can't afford are sold. Olivia looked down at the floor tiles beneath her feet. Why not just sell them up here? There's no harm in that. When Mr. Cecily caught ear of her statement, his bushy eyebrows lowered as he seemed to enter a somewhat contemplative state. He remained like this for about 30 seconds, the only sound permeating the air was the tapping of his boot against the wooden floor. Suddenly, his eyes widened as he grabbed the bottle of wine, throwing it against the wall. Cut that out. Olivia and Aizawa collectively flinched when the bottle was sent in their direction. It hit the wall behind them with a clatter, colliding with a painting hoisted on the wall of a dragon, causing it to fall to the ground and shatter its glass casing. What the? Aizawa's voice contained no trace of malice. Olivia, who had now recovered from the shock, looked at Mr. Cecily alongside Aizawa. The man with a stubble was rubbing the spot above his eyelid where the bandage was. You didn't choose to arrest me, why? Shinso began to question the earlier statements made by Ms. Jasmine. Humphrey, who was still in the wooden chair and reading his book, set the novel down on the floor and sighed. To be completely honest, we don't perceive you as a threat for the most part. As for where you got a potion or what pathway you're on, it is unbeknownst to us. I'm on the justice pathway, Shinso replied, sitting up in his chair. A tiny amount of sweat accumulated on his brow upon saying that. The boy began to question if telling Humphrey his pathway was a good idea. Unexpectedly, Humphrey's lips curled upwards into a smile. Hey, same, he replied. It's one of the pathways under the domain of Mother Nature. At that moment, he looked towards Shinso with a more serious expression. Perhaps you could join the pollinators. Hearing this offer, the boy was somewhat stunned. Join you? The dark-skinned man nodded. Yes, we have pathway potions up to Order 6 in our inventory. He picked the book back up from the floor, his smile widening slightly. You'd be proficient in no time, and you'd be protecting this kingdom. After digesting all the current information, he thought back to what he had heard in the beginning of the meeting at Aaron's establishment. Carter had stolen the pathway potions of the Saint and Justice pathways from the Mother Nature Church. This could also mean that Ayumi would also reap benefits after her recovery. I also have a friend you might be interested, Shinso smiled softly, folding one leg over the other. He placed one hand on my shoulder, squeezing softly. Her name is Ayumi, and she's also a seeker. She's on the Saint pathway, but she's currently injured. May I ask what happened? Humphrey asked, his curiosity and concern brewing like a stew. Shinso sighed softly, looking back at my form. I was now asleep, my lips parted slightly as I faced the wall. When we were first undergoing training at a friend's establishment, she strangely passed out after experiencing ravings and visions. His hand trailed to my hair, running through the silky, slightly greasy locks. He also passed out from something, but he recovered quickly. You mentioned ravings, Humphrey asked, standing up from the chair. The dark-skinned man suddenly walked over to the window, peering out at the crimson moon. This time, the red Goliath in the sky wasn't obscured by the clouds. For the most part, the snowfall had actually dissipated, and the clouds had moved elsewhere, allowing the duo an unobstructed view. The blood moon isn't for 2 more weeks, Humphrey's voice lowered to a whisper, his hands slightly trembling against the windowsill as he gazed up at the moon. Blood moon. Shinso wasn't familiar with the subject for the most part. He arched one of his eyebrows, feeling a surge of curiosity. You know, when every once in a while, when everyone seems to party a little harder one night, particularly when the moon is full. He looked back at Shinso, expecting a reply. Shinso shook his head. He didn't want to reveal the truth about his origins just yet, so he made a last-second excuse. My parents send me to bed early during the blood moon, I don't know why. Your parents? Do you hear them downstairs? Humphrey quickly prompted him with another question. Shinso shook his head. I fall asleep rather quickly. At that moment, the dark-skinned man let out a low sigh. He stepped back from the window and approached the bed, sitting down beside the indigo-haired boy. The weight of the man made the bed tilt a tiny amount beneath Shinso. During the blood moon, the most malevolent of existences awaken from the darkness, using the crimson moon as a beacon to cause chaos and feast upon the spirituality of everyone in sight. He looked towards the door, which was still left ajar since Aizawa departed. On the blood moon, I recommend you be careful. Lock your doors and hide away. Hearing his instructions, Shinso was suddenly puzzled. You mentioned that everyone parties on that night, why don't they hide too? Humphrey's grip on the windowsill loosened. His meaty hands found their way to Shinso's collar, giving it a sharp tug. Humans can't realize when their souls and minds are being eaten from the inside out. For some reason we can't explain, there's this strange euphoria when a mortal is being broken down by a wraith or spirit. He leaned in closer, his lips parting. But the worst part is that they can't see them. Only seekers can see the mystical creatures and attempt to stop them. The dark-skinned man pointed towards the door once again. If they figure out you have mystical abilities, they'll attempt to devour your entire body to satiate their unending hunger. After Humphrey finished his complete explanation, Shinso didn't know what to say. I apologize, it appears my headaches are a true pain. Mr. Cecily chuckled softly, removing his hand from his brow and rapping it against the desk. Olivia looked back at the bottle on the floor, along with the shattered painting, and sighed softly. Are you tired? No, I'm not, the man replied with a small smile. Aizawa's eyes narrowed in slight concern. Within Mr. Cecily's dark-colored eyes, he could faintly spot a tinge of deceit. You are tired, Mr. Cecily, he said, his voice softening. At that moment, the man with the stubble fell back in his chair. His body hit the wooden floor with a bash as he took the chair down with him. The chair collided with the table in short succession, causing a plethora of items to fall from the table and onto the floor. His half-empty cup of wine spilled onto the hardwood, and a stack of papers and tax forms flew in the chair like a cluster of feathers, all coming to rest around his form. The dark-haired man let out a low whimper as he shuffled to the corner, raising his hands over his head in a seemingly protective stance. His bottom lip quivered as he spat out a series of hazy, frantic phrases and words. Don't. I'm not crazy. The entire time his eyes remained open. Aizawa and Olivia remained motionless, and they could see the liquid slowly accumulating in the corners of his eyes. The man's arms and legs trembled, flailing in all directions as if attempting to wrinkle out of some invisible, inscrutable grip. Mr. Cecily scratched and clawed at the chair, his hands frantically moving to unbutton his coat and toss it against the wall in front of him. The duo watched, both unable to speak, as Mr. Cecily frantically undressed himself until he was completely nude. The now naked man was left scratching and clawing at the air, alongside his skin. The man's pale skin was adorned with a myriad of scars and stitched-up wounds. Some of the wounds were deeper than others, some bloodier and more grotesque than others. The most notable one on his body, the one that immediately caught their attention, was the deep scar trailing vertically down his chest, going down to the area just above his genitals. This wound was a completely straight line, conducted with almost surgical precision. The only thing distinguishing it from professionalism was the somewhat jagged edges of the wound, small rivets where the performer seemed to have either messed up or purposely mishandled it for an unknown reason. On other spots of his body were areas sealed off by bandages, mostly on his arms and inner thighs. Some were on his legs and chest. But the area which made Aizawa's stomach flip upside down was a bandage right above his genitals and anus. What the hell? Aizawa's body was frozen in terror as he watched Mr. Cecily frantically scramble upwards onto his feet, his trembling hands adorned with dirty fingernails finding their way to one of the drawers of the desk. He quickly opened one, taking out what appeared to be a syringe. It was a small surgical needle with a pointed tip. The barrel of the syringe didn't contain any liquids or anesthetics, it was completely empty. At that moment, Mr. Cecily's lips twitched upwards into a crazed smile as he slammed the needle downwards into his left eye, penetrating the eyeball just below the bandage. Aizawa watched, horrified as a torrent of crimson blood squirted upwards like a macabre fountain from the now bleeding eyeball. Mr. Cecily didn't seem to react to this. Instead, he continued to jab the needle into his eye socket over and over, puncturing more holes and releasing more blood. It wasn't long until his entire face was coated with the crimson liquid, slowly dripping downwards onto the desk, and slowly running down his pale, bruise-mottled body. He looked towards Olivia and Aizawa, his face bearing the unending smile. Olivia's face was pale with fear, and Aizawa bore a similar expression as the woman beside him. The duo watched in silence as Mr. Cecily walked over to the bottle on the floor. His frail fingers wrapped around the coldness of the bottle, bringing the beverage to his lips as he took a final, hearty gulp. Shortly after, he put the bottle back onto the table and grinned even wider, the edges of his mouth stretching to a capacity that bordered on the inhumane. Without saying a word, Mr. Cecily slammed his head downwards into the bottle. The sound of broken glass echoed throughout the room as the man's eye had been completely punctuated by the bottle, steadily leaking blood. Mr. Cecily's only working eye suddenly rolled back, showing only the whites, couples with some crimson veins and a feint of bloodshot as he collapsed to the ground. The naked man hit the floor with a soundless slump, habitually curling into a ball as the soft rising and falling in his chest gradually ceased. Olivia let out a shrill scream, pushing the chair over as she darted to the other end of the room. The pungent stench of alcohol mixed with blood quickly filtered into the room. At that moment, the red-haired bartender burst into the room, staring down at the carnage. His face paled, and his eyes rolled back as he fainted to the floor. When the weak-bodied bartender eventually regained consciousness, his blue eyes opened, only to be greeted by Aizawa and Olivia, who looked at him with skeptical looks. In a panic, he tried to move his arms, but the thick bindings sealing him to the leg of the boss's desk prevented much mobility. He looked back at the thick ropes, his eyes widening slightly in inscrutable panic. He refused to let surface around the duo. Aizawa was the first one to speak. He took an authoritative step forward, placing one of his boots in front of the area of the floor closest to the bartender, as if silently threatening to step on his chest. "What is this?" he asked, gesturing for Olivia to give him the vial. The woman nodded her head. Her face was still slightly pale from the encounter, but they had covered the corpse of the naked boss with his clothing to prevent visible distress from any of them in the room. Olivia tossed the vial to Aizawa, who swiftly caught it. He rolled the small object between his thumb and forefinger for a few moments, silently observing the dark-colored liquid sloshing inside. His crimson eyes flickered as he gazed back at the bartender. Aizawa then repeated his question. "What is this?" He took another step forward, pressing a little body weight into his boot, causing the floor tile underneath it to creak eerily. The sound was reminiscent of a ghoul screaming in pain. He held up the vial to the bartender, his hand inches from the man's pale and freckled face. The bartender remained silent, his bottom lip quivering as he stared into the vial, observing the dark-colored liquid sloshing around slowly as Aizawa continued his ministrations on the bottle. "I don't know what that is," he choked out. The entire time, he was slowly moving his body back and forth in an attempt to wriggle himself loose from the bindings obscuring his hands. "Are you sure? We found it in an old lady's food." Aizawa recalled the dinner they had earlier that night. Upon hearing that, the red-haired man's eyes narrowed slightly as he gazed into the bottle with more conspicuous attention. His lips parted slightly, but he looked like he wasn't willing to talk just yet. "Looks like the packing of our spices. Every Monday the agricultural facility ships us spices to help with our dishes." He looked up at Aizawa, his freckled features extruding with tangible innocence. Aizawa cocked his head slightly as his boot dug more into the floor tile. "Mind showing us to the room where you keep them? Will you undo my bindings?" The bartender asked sheepishly, looking back to the ropes sealing his hands once more. "Yes, we will," Aizawa replied, bending down. He worked with an almost mechanical precision as he undid the ropes in a matter of seconds. Once the man felt the pressure coiling tight around his wrists fall slack, the sound of the ropes hitting the wooden floor, he stood up and held his wrists with either of his hands. Both of his wrists had red markings stretching across them, and a bruise had already begun to form. "Thank you," he looked up at Aizawa, offering the man an innocent smile, attempting to deter any malevolent feelings from the dark-haired man. At that moment, Aizawa looked back to Olivia, gesturing towards the corpse on the ground which was covered by the clothing. "Watch him until we come back, then we'll escort him to the proper authorities." Olivia nodded, looking back to the heap of suits and ties on the floor, gulping down her Adam's apple. Aizawa was led behind the bar, entering the kitchen area. The moment he stepped in, he was immediately greeted by the overwhelming sensations of smell and heat brushing against his skin and nostrils. When he sniffed the air around him, Aizawa immediately smelled numerous stews and broths brewing in corresponding stoves. On the far end of the kitchen area, which was partially obscured by an excessive amount of steam, Aizawa spotted the pots and pans at work with frying and treating to the dishes and other meals. In other areas of the kitchen, he spotted numerous chefs at work. Most of them bore tired expressions, their eyes almost dropping shut as they stirred and fried numerous ingredients together in pots and pans. One of them, a young woman in hair sealed behind a net, almost fell asleep, slumping forward into a plate of mashed potatoes. "Shouldn't they be at home?" Aizawa inquired, gazing upon the numerous cooks with a partially sympathetic expression. About that, the bartender trailed off, opening a cabinet overhead. Inside, Aizawa could see countless small vials filled with multicolored spices. Some of them ranged in colors and flavors, but the overall theme of them was they were all dark-colored. "We cook for the homeless of the kingdom, something the government doesn't really do much to treat in the first place." The red-haired bartender with a face sprinkled with freckles took out a large collection of the spices, lining them onto the counter in a neat row. Aizawa bent down, taking a small moment to observe the spices. The entire time, he was continually rolling the dark-colored liquid between his thumb and forefinger. He then held up the bottle and placed it beside the others, measuring it as a pillar of reference. "This one is bigger," Aizawa commented, bending down even further and gazing at the numerous vials lined up in a row. The dark-colored liquid was noticeably taller than the others in the row, but the only other noticeable difference was its lack of label. "Why'd you take it in if you knew it didn't have a label?" Aizawa then turned to the bartender, raising an eyebrow. "Some of our samples are left unidentified, but the Seraphis Agricultural Facility deems them all safe to consume atop of food," he replied, his smile twitching around the edges. "But, this isn't a spice, it's a liquid." Aizawa grasped the bottle, sloshing it around again in front of the bartender. The bartender gulped, reaching towards another cabinet beside the other one. "We also receive wine samples from the agricultural facility too." He opened the cabinet, allowing the man a clear view of the other bottles of wine. They were all larger bottles, reminiscent of the one inside the boss's office. Aizawa looked down at the vials of liquid for a few more moments before scoffing. "Please, you receive samples that could barely taste on the tongue. Why get stuff like this when you have all of that in a cabinet?" Aizawa silently lampooned. "Earlier we saw that your boss's wine was patented by an asylum. Do these come from similar places?" Upon hearing his question, the bartender let out a shaky sigh. His lips twitched downwards into a frown. "Did he mention the underground market by chance?" Aizawa nodded. "Yes." The bartender suddenly let out a shaky whine. "Damn it, the boss has been acting so weird before he just died like that." "What do you mean?" Aizawa suddenly felt a rush of curiosity. The bartender adjusted his bowtie before explaining. "About a month ago he was a grumpy geezer, always bossing us around and stuff. After he came back from a little night out with his wife, he entered this bar acting like he'd been given a dose of sunshine. He continued to fiddle with his bowtie the longer he explained. Shortly after, we all saw raises in our paychecks, but the boss made us work longer shifts." The red-haired man pointed down the line of busy cooks. "As you see right now." Aizawa took a moment of observing the cooks, noticing the way they sluggishly moved along with their duties and responsibilities. Some of them lethargically cleaned dishes of grease and residual food, while others diced up potatoes and carrots to add to a concoction boiling beside them on the stove. "Have you ever talked to your boss beforehand?" Aizawa asked, turning back to the bartender. The man with icy blue eyes shivered as if recalling some distant yet horrifying memory. I have in the past, yes." He looked away, facing the rows of bottles on the counter. I was one of the lousiest cooks in the entire restaurant. Due to the amount of negative reviews on this place, he didn't hesitate to give me a beating and reposition me elsewhere in this establishment. Why not fire you? Aizawa cocked an eyebrow. My boss always said that, nobody is completely worthless, but everyone's trash continues to stink, even after being thrown out. Hearing these words, Aizawa sighed softly. Sounds like he never thinks anyone is truly beyond redemption. If he thought that, he would have surely fired you. But instead, he decided you were good behind a counter scrubbing drinks and serving people. Why yeah, maybe he just wanted to see me. The bartender's face flushed slightly, as his shoulders stiffened with an accompanying, self-deprecating chuckle. Suddenly, they heard a scream echo within the kitchen. The young woman who had almost fallen asleep earlier let out a yell as she fell back onto the floor. When the duo turned their heads, they both noticed the predicament. She had spilled some of the stew on herself, scalding her face with blood-red welts. Oh my God! The bartender rushed over, shoving aside a cook and helping her onto her feet. The entire time, her hands remained clasped over her face, tears burning down her cheeks as she cried out in pain. Medic! He cried out, quickly surveying the kitchen. Nobody moved from their positions. It was like watching zombies handle culinary devices and food before their very eyes. Medic! He shouted again, his movements and handling slowly growing more frantic. Nobody moved a second time. Damn it! He gritted out, bursting open the door leading from the kitchen and running across the main section of the bar. Aizawa followed him out into the cold weather. Without hesitation, he lowered the woman's head into the freezing snow. Don't! Aizawa cautioned, taking a hold of the woman. Snow can negatively affect the burn. What do we do? The bartender gazed at the woman, his expression filled with palpable worry. In the bathroom, Aizawa ran some cool water under a towel, before applying it to the woman's face. She let out a low wince when it made contact, but she quickly stopped whimpering after a few seconds. She's obviously very tired, Aizawa noted, looking down at her form with concern. Jack shit, I still wonder why our boss makes us work so late, the bartender grumbled. You got a name? Aizawa looked towards him. Leo, he replied. Hearing the name, Aizawa rolled it on his tongue for a few moments. All right. He looked back at the woman, who had now fallen silent and was taking deep breaths. You all right? Why yeah, I'll just need these injuries patched up and I'll be sent back to the kitchen in no time, she said with a smile. Leo, are there any bandages nearby? The red-haired man surveyed the surroundings for a brief moment. I believe our boss kept a first aid kit nearby. Quickly opening the overhead cabinet, he scanned the objects inside. Among the numerous soups and miscellaneous objects you'd usually find inside a bathroom, he was able to locate a medical kit nested within a compartment in the back. After he quickly slid it out, he placed it on the bathroom floor. As he opened it, his eyes widened upon seeing the lack of bandages. Inside the medical kit were a wide spectrum of unorthodox items. Among them were a deck of hand-painted cards with numerous household objects, a small bell, a handheld journal with a lock lined with dark green leather, and a small amount of candles including a lighter beside it. What the? He took out some of the items, including the bell and journal. That's a first aid kit. Aizawa belittled, gazing down at the leather case with bronze hinges. On the top of the case were letters inscribed within it. A gift to Sanson Cecile. Aizawa quickly summoned Olivia into the room, instructing her to find a medical professional to take the woman to. As the blonde-haired woman led her out the door, Leo turned back to Aizawa, whose gaze was laser-focused on the medical kit in front of him. Why do you think this has such weird stuff? He asked, pointing down at the box in front of the dark-haired man. Aizawa reached into the leather box and removed the small bell, ringing it in the air. The sound gently reverberated across the bathroom, hanging in the silence for a brief moment longer than it should. Why would this be for my boss? Leo continued to question the peculiarity of the medical kit, picking up the leather case and holding it up to the dim lights of the kerosene-powered lamp. The other items are just as strange, he noted, grabbing the deck of cards with objects painted on them. One of the cards had the image of a rocking chair on its surface. When Leo flipped it over, it had the image of an owl hanging on a branch. In the background, he could see the sunset gently grazing a snow-covered forest. Another one of the cards had a spider on its front side, wrapping a bumblebee in its silk. On the other side, they saw a candle on a wooden table. Over the candle was a glass case, and the candle's light allowed them to see a clear view of the surroundings of the painting. The walls of the room were dark and made of wood, the paint colored a mixture between black and brown. Other items were sprawled on the desk, like an apple and a pocket watch. After looking through a few more cards, Leo looked back at Aizawa with a tangible puzzlement. The duo remained silent as Aizawa took another item from the case. It was the candle with the lighter. The candle was about the height of a pencil and as thick as a can of soup. The wax near the top was an ashen gray color, while the rest of its surface had a healthy, white sheen. The small matches accompanying the candle had mostly been unlit, but Aizawa and Leo could quickly distinguish between the ones that had been touched and the ones that hadn't. This was evident through the darkened, almost powdery substance on top of the matches, which was most likely ash or soot that had accumulated over time, or dust. Who knew how old the leather case was? At that moment, a small piece of paper fell from inside the case. It landed on the floor beside them with a soft thud. The surface of the paper wasn't the usual white, it was peppered with dust and other inscrutable materials. From the looks of it, the paper was also folded into fourths. Leo quickly knelt down and picked up the piece of paper, slowly unfolding it and revealing its contents. The words on the paper were barely legible in the dim lighting, but the duo knew that it wouldn't be an issue considering they had a multitude of other options. The red-haired man turned towards the bathroom door, exchanging a final glance with Aizawa before nodding his head. Aizawa then stood up and approached the door, opening it and stepping into the dining area. The group of men dating to the altercation earlier that night were still leisurely sipping their beverages. A few of them were slumped forward, their eyes half-lidded and drooling as they succumbed to a drunk-embraced slumber on the cold countertop. I was planning on wiping down the counters later, Leo chuckled with a smile. In return, Aizawa sighed and took the piece of paper from the bartender, positioning it on the table under a much brighter lamp. Now, the duo would somewhat clearly read the contents of the paper. It was addressed to Sanson Cecile, the owner of the bar. Leo slowly read the first line. Following your visit, we were pleased that you had recovered from your issues. To celebrate this occasion, we had this sensory kit shipped to your establishment to prevent further issues. Leo read between the lines of the note, every word he spoke gathering in the back of his mind. You'll find a series of wondersome items at your disposal, such as index cards, the candles and matches, along with the diary, which you can feel free to write down your thoughts inside. If you encounter any issues, visit this address for further conditioning, 827 Rue de Blanches. After finishing the letter, Leo turned to Aizawa and gave the man a curious look, his eyebrows raising slightly. He sounds like he's been places. Aizawa grabbed the note from the table and read it over again. This time, he noticed something that the latter hadn't realized. The man flipped the paper back to Leo, pointing towards the bottom of the paper with his index finger. This comes from the asylum, the same one that patented the wine. Upon hearing this, the man's eyes widened as he stood up. His gaze beelined to the front door, leading out into the snow-covered streets. We should get moving and head to that address. All right, Aizawa agreed, standing up from his chair and dusting himself off. As the duo approached the door, Leo suddenly turned back to the group of drunken men sitting at the counter and yelled. Go home, what should we do to prepare for the blood moon? Shinso asked, folding his arms. The dark-skinned man looked towards the bed, to my sleeping form. Malevolent spirits like wraiths heavily favor the dead and sleeping, so if any of your loved ones or friends are sleeping, immediately rouse them. You mentioned the dead. Shinso paused for a beat, his face contorting slightly. They'll be possessed by the wraiths, so they won't be what you'd call zombies, Humphrey replied, sensing Shinso's weariness. A few weeks in advance, as pollinators always favor heading over to the graveyards and commencing with the cleansing ritual. Humphrey pointed out the window, focusing his finger in the direction of a large patch of land just past the cathedral. You spoke of the undead as if they're regular. You doing the ritual makes it sound like you seal off the threat entirely. At that moment, Humphrey fell silent for a few seconds. Well, in a way, we seal off most of the corpses in the vicinity. His finger darted to another patch of land. It stretched beyond the outskirts of the Victorian-style city, stretching into the evergreen trees that lined the area just before the mountains. Dwellers outside the kingdom tend to bury their folk within the ground instead of a graveyard. Due to laws prohibiting trespassing, we can't perform the corresponding ritual on the dead outside the graveyards. Hearing this, Shinso's blood almost ran cold. What do you do with the undead that enter the kingdom? Won't they cause panic among the partying civilians? Trust me, they won't notice, they'll be too busy partying and drinking. Humphrey's voice lowered to almost a whisper, his bottom lip quivering slightly. That's how my spouse died. At that moment, Humphrey regained his thoughts and huffed. But that's the past. If we can head over there, we can perform the ritual. His lips twitched up as he turned towards Shinso. Maybe that's how we'll invite you into our ranks. I'd have to receive permission from my friends. Before Shinso could finish his sentence, Humphrey's large hand wrapped around him as he was yanked towards the door. The boy didn't have time to put on a coat as he was led down the hallway and down the flight of stairs. When they stepped out into the bitter cold, the man immediately began walking down the streets towards the cathedral. I'll have the division who's not working on the Trimbris and the captain assist us. The duo walked in silence for a few more moments before ceasing before the stone stairs. Humphrey turned back to Shinso and instructed him to wait in front of the building before he turned around and entered the cathedral. As he entered the stone doors and shut them behind him, Shinso huffed, a small torrent of smoke leaving his mouth as he sat down on the stone stairs facing the rest of the city. Snow had now ceased falling from the sky, the clouds had completely departed and allowed the crimson moon to shine down upon the kingdom. The moonlight bathed the slanted rooftops and gave wake to a myriad of complex shadows that crept down the sides of the buildings and spilled into the streets. In one of the shadows, Shinso spotted a pair of green eyes boring into him. His heart burst out of his chest upon a first glance, but he quickly collected himself and stared back into the shadows. A moment later, a small, black paw outstretched from the darkness, followed by another. The furry face of a cat emerged from the darkness, meowing softly at Shinso. His body relaxed as the cat slowly made its way over to Shinso, making its way up the cathedral stairs and curling up beside him. The cat possessed a mostly relaxed demeanor, the only contrast was the swishing of its tail back and forth on the steps. Suddenly, Shinso heard a flurry of footsteps hurrying in his direction. When he turned his head, he caught sight of a group of pollinators entering the cathedral with large wooden boxes in hand. One of the boxes had a long head of hair protruding from the slightly ajar lid. Was that the servant that was found in such a state back at the manor? Before Shinso could finish his question, the doors opened once again behind him, and Humphrey, followed by a small team of pollinators, stepped out into the street. They all faced Shinso, the dark-colored man's expression less judgmental and critical than the others. This is his rite of passage, Humphrey explained to the others. His gaze flickered to the cat sleeping beside him, his lips curling up slightly. It appears you have a friend with you. Shinso slowly stood up, not making eye contact with the others as they proceeded down the street. When they arrived at the graveyard, Shinso felt a cold shiver course through his body upon seeing the tombstones, which were covered in snow. Unexpectedly, the black cat had actually followed them, the feline brushing against Shinso's leg with its furry head whilst letting out a continuous, low purr. The group of pollinators made their way into the graveyard, taking out candles from their pockets and lifting them with the flick of their wrists. They then scattered the candles across the graveyard, enough to vastly illuminate the space. With the blessing of Mother Nature, I command a cleansing of this domain during the period of tribulation. Humphrey lowered his head, humming in a low voice as he clasped the candle in his hands, which had begun to tremble. Across the graveyard, other pollinators proceeded with a similar action, all reciting the honorific statement and lowering their heads. Shinso's eyes widened in astonishment as the ground below him began to tremble slightly. The indigo-haired boy watched as roots and plants began to sprout from under the ground, erecting upwards into the sky and coiling around the gravestones. The vines sprouted with colorful, vivid flowers that contrasted the dreary, almost desolate landscape of winter. The flowers' petals all fell off in unison, sinking into the powdery snow and diffusing into balls of radiant light. The lights all faded away, sinking into the snow and melting it in small patches across the graveyard. After everything had fallen silent was the moment Humphrey could finally breathe again. At this moment he looked towards Shinso whilst stuffing the candle back into his coat. "Welcome to the pollinators," he said with a smile. The other members of the group all turned to Shinso, gazing into him with partially indifferent yet casual expressions. Chapter 68, A Troubling Bunch. By the time the duo arrived at the given address, the sun had actually begun to rise over the mountain. 827 Rue de Blanches was a small building nestled between a corner store and a craftsman's place. The corner store had only just opened, the old lady running the building flipping the sign to indicate its status of approach. The craftsman's store had already begun to buzz with the sounds of clockwork and machinery. Whoever was inside either had lots of work to attend to, or they had a passion for their craft, almost to the extent of waking up before the sun was up. The front of the building appeared casual, almost to an ECRIC extent. In contrast to the harsh winter temperatures, whoever owned the establishment favored floral quantity over convenience. Lining the narrow path leading to the front door were lots of flowers. Half of them were buried beneath the thick white snow. On the contrary, the taller flowers extruded past the snow, stretching to the sky in an attempt to soak in as much sunlight as they could before the quickness of the winter's day snatched such an opportunity. Aizawa was the first one to approach the door, refusing to knock and silently peering through the window. For the most part, the entire establishment was dimly lit. In what the man could see through the window, the outlines of numerous household objects and other accommodations were clearly visible. Even as more of the sun granted visibility, the inside of the house wasn't something Aizawa could so easily access by sight. At that moment, Aizawa's hand shifted to the wooden door. The surface had been slightly chipped. The wooden surface of the door was either modeled by the environment, or the lack of maintenance from the owner. With a tinge of hesitance, the dark-haired man knocked on its surface. He silently looked back at Leo, the skinny man, now dressed in attire more suitable for the cold, tensed inexplicably as he stared at the darkened window. "Are you sure anyone even lives here?" Leo, remaining in his spot. Aizawa remained silent, his observant demeanor never ceasing, even for a moment. His hands slowly trailed over the chips on the door's surface, the rough and jagged texture reminding Aizawa of the possibility of getting a splinter. Considering the medical approach of the time, he might get thrown into an institution for something as small as that. After a moment, he looked back at Leo and blinked. "I don't entirely think so, but I wouldn't reject another possibility." Leo shifted his hands to his pockets, silently fidgeting with them from view as he continued to probe Aizawa. Who knows how old that suitcase was? Upon hearing his statement, Aizawa once again entered a period of silence. He turned back to the door, before taking a hold of the doorknob. When the cold metal greeted his warm palms, the man tensed slightly. After closing his eyes and taking a breath, he silently opened the door. The only sound aside from his heart pounding in his ears was the door squeaking as it allowed the duo entry to the establishment. They were greeted with a dark, narrow hallway with insufficient lighting on both sides. Strangely, the kerosene-powered lamp above the door was on. Upon noticing this, Aizawa looked back at Leo. "The light's on, someone's probably here." Leo's boots crunched against the snow as he silently made his way to the entry of the house, slowly creeping up the wooden steps and brushing his boots off on the carpet. After everything was done, he finally looked back at Aizawa. The duo made their way forward, Aizawa the most vigilant and hyper-aware of the two. When they rounded the first corner, Leo noticeably tensed upon seeing the living room. This part of the house was obscured from view from the outside. In the corner of the room, the fireplace was on. The light from the fire seemed to ease them both, but this sudden tranquility was abruptly shattered the moment Aizawa looked to the floor. The carpet in the middle of the room was noticeably ajar, revealing something underneath. In the fireplace's light, Aizawa quickly made out an object, a metal handle bolted into the wood. "What the?" Aizawa mumbled as he knelt down, wrapping his hands around the metal. This time, it wasn't like the door handle outside. It was warm, as if something or someone had previously made contact with it. Without wasting any time, Aizawa instinctively pulled at the handle, dislodging the portion of floor from the rest of it. The sound of grinding gears and machinery were muffled underneath the floorboards, an audible sign of something transpiring. Aizawa and Leo both watched as the floor raised on its own, revealing a passageway that descended into darkness. Unlike the manor, this was a drop down. In the dim lighting, Aizawa quickly made out what appeared to be a ladder. In the Mother Nature Cathedral, Humphrey silently led Shinso down the stairs behind the altar. As they entered the dimly lit corridor, Shinso immediately looked towards the ongoing surgery on the Trimbris. The creature resembling a female had been killed for this process to prevent issues. The lifeless Trimbris had been slumped onto the table. A large light shone overhead the creature, revealing everything transpiring. Shinso saw that a large portion of its chest had been sliced into and removed. Inside, numerous bodily organs and systems were silently operated on, either being rearranged or removed. At that moment, one of the doctors made a small incision, severing the heart of the Trimbris from the rest of its body. She removed the organ and placed it on a metal tray alongside the other organs which had been dealt with. Some of them seemed to move and pulse as if still alive. Seeing this, Shinso shivered slightly. "It seems surgical operations aren't your cup of tea," Humphrey teased, leading Shinso down the hallway. The indigo-haired boy swallowed the bulge in his throat and spoke up, his voice low, "What do I do to become a pollinator?" The dark-skinned man chuckled as they came to a door at the end of the small hallway. It had a dark surface with green marking inscribed into the wood. A metal nameplate hung at about Humphrey's height, with his name branded into it with an italic font. He silently opened the door and stepped aside, allowing Shinso entry. "Allow me to explain." The inside of the office smelled of something pleasant, though the location of such a scent was unbeknownst to him. Sitting on Humphrey's desk was a plant similar to the one he had seen earlier that night. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Lining the shelves on either side of the desk were similar plants, all possessing sharp teeth and a carnivorous attitude. As if sensing Shinso's weariness, Humphrey scoffed. "Don't worry, that scent you smell keeps them calm." He walked behind his desk before opening a drawer and removing a large metal case. The inside was filled to the brim with different files. They were all tan in color, some of them in better condition than others. "You mentioned you're a seeker, correct?" Humphrey asked, cocking an eyebrow as his bulky hands shuffled through the numerous files. "Why yes," Shinso replied with a nod, alongside a smile that twitched around the edges. At that moment, Humphrey took out a particular file from the set. He placed it down on the desk in front of Shinso, silently gesturing for him to take it. The indigo-haired boy let out a low, shaky breath as he grasped the file and opened it. Inside the file was a small stack of papers, all messily arranged. Alongside the papers were a noticeable amount of photographs. "Hey, we're one of the few organizations to specialize in owning a camera," Humphrey gloated, smiling as he observed Shinso's actions. Shinso began to shuffle through the papers, his eyes scanning over the miscellaneous information scattered across what seemed to be volumes worth of information. One of the papers, a sheet with a dirty, almost ancient-looking texture, gravitated his attention. He looked up at Humphrey, cocking an eyebrow. "What's this?" he asked, raising the paper to grant the man a view. Upon seeing the paper, Humphrey closed his eyes and sharply drew a breath. "One of our more recent troubles. It's plagued us for months now." "Recent?" Shinso inquired, feeling a surge of puzzlement. "This looks ancient." "Not ancient, just dirty." Humphrey took the paper and scanned its contents. "Across the kingdom there's been a large scale of robberies, acts that even our echelons fail to properly track," His hands tightened around the edges of the paper, slightly wrinkling it. Whoever these thieves are have been stealing everything from food, clothing, even a few potions from our stash. At that moment, Shinso's body tensed slightly. He knew well that Catherine and Carter had stolen the potions from the Mother Nature Church. But ratting them out and giving specific locations shatter any semblance of trust between the two of them and him. Do you have any leads? Shinso asked, leaning forward. Humphrey nodded his head, taking the file back from Shinso and looking deeper into its contents. After a few seconds, he removed a set of 2 photos. Both of them were blurry, as if taken in a frenzy. The boy took the photos and closely analyzed them. In the photos, he could faintly see the bodies of 2 of the figures. One of them was a woman with light-colored hair, a monocle on her eye, and wearing a more gentlemanly outfit. The other person was a man with freckles, his hair medium length almost obscuring his CYCS. He was clad in a casual shirt and pants more habitual of an ordinary person in the kingdom. Shinso suppressed his emotions upon closely investigating the figures' appearances. They bore a close resemblance to Catherine and Carter, but they also had some noticeable changes to their clothing and accessories. Is this some sort of disguise on their end? He looked back up at Humphrey and sighed. What makes you think they're suspects? Clarice, the leader of our division specializing in criminal investigation and photography, captured this scene shortly after a robbery was reported in that particular location. His hands rapped on the edge of the desk as he continued explaining. When we took the photos back to the cathedral, we ran a spirituality test on them, but only this one appeared positive for containing some sort of ill intent. Hearing his words, Shinso audibly gulped. You said you failed to track them down, why? You have clear-cut evidence right here. He picked up the photographs holding them up to the light. Because any form of divination fails. We can't track them down, we can't lure them out, we'll have to resort to other methods of knowing such information. At that moment, Shinso began to concentrate. His brows furrowed as he gazed into the photos, the black and white hues gradually turning brighter and more vibrant. Using his newly honed vision, he silently assessed the photographs of the duo. His eyes widened when he caught sight of the spiritual aura of the photographs. They were black, similar to the captain's aura. After quickly reverting his vision to normal, Shinso looked back to the captain and sighed. Since we can't find those criminals in the meantime, are there any things I could assist you with? Actually, yes, Humphrey clasped his hands together, looking towards Shinso with a now concerned expression. I recommend you get some sleep, you look awfully tired. Stepping out into the fresh morning sun, Shinso raised his hands over his eyes to filter it out. As he stepped down the cathedral stairs, he suddenly collided with a figure. He was sent down onto his rear, and he let out a grunt of pain from the collision. Shinso. A feminine voice called out, ringing with obvious concern. The boy lowered his hand, gazing at the figure. She had black hair tousled into a messy bun, rounded glasses, and a round face. It was Ayumi. Why you recovered that quickly? Shinso stumbled to his feet, feeling a wave of shock wash over him. Yeah, Carter and Catherine gave me a concoction after some physical training. Even Mr. Ryujin stopped by a little while earlier. That's good to hear. Shinso rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I heard about all the shit that happened last night, Ayumi suddenly said. How's Isaac doing? At that moment, Shinso sighed softly, his voice lowering. That's hard to answer. Why? Ayumi's brows furrowed. Today he'll either have some surgery or we'll send him to the medical place downtown. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.